One Piece is back and bigger than ever because we have things to talk about, including a very special appearance by a certain character that I would bet cold hard, or at least solid room temperature cash money, that a lot of readers didn't even see. I should also let you know that if you're watching this in the future, then just know that One Piece has just come back from an emergency 2-week break, which was a bit brutal because that came off the back of a planned 2-week break, and as a result I have been suffering from fictional pirate withdrawal. But this chapter starts by tying our current Elbaf events into what we saw of the island during Egghead while Shanks was there. We start at the, I was going to say small bar that we saw, but I don't think the word small is ever going to apply to anything on this island, so I should probably just remove it from my lexicon for the next 2 years until Elbaf's over. But we are officially introduced to the small child who was asking to join the Red Hair Pirates. His name is Kolon, spelled suspiciously like colon. It's koron in Japanese for what it's worth. And he may seem a bit superfluous at the moment, but kids in One Piece usually serve very important roles, especially if they're introduced right at the beginning of an arc. Tama is a good illustration of this. Luffy met her first thing on Wano, and she played one of the most integral roles on the island, converting all of the Smile users, and her starvation being Luffy's main driving force throughout the arc. And I think that Colin is also quite special because of his design. It's a pretty overt reference to the titular Vicky in Vicky the Viking, which, if you're unaware, is one of Oda's core inspirations for One Piece. Oda absolutely adored this show, and I don't think he's going to pay tribute to it through a character who doesn't become at least somewhat important. And right now, Colin is heading all the way up to the next tier of Elbaf to meet Luffy, because our future Pirate King comes highly recommended by Shanks. I can't imagine this is all gonna go to plan though. Colin's probably gonna get into some sort of child-related trouble and need saving from someone in the crew. And what I can imagine happening is a callback to Chapter 1 with Colin asking to join the Straw Hat Pirates and Luffy needing to give him the Shanks response of, you're not quite old enough and I'm not a very good parent. I mean, did you hear what happened to my daughter? Left her on a destroyed island in a pile of corpses, I did. And then Colin might even go on to have his own Higuma the Bear situation, just on a much larger scale where Luffy saves and inspires him. I think something like that would be very nice because Luffy is now at the point where he's considered an equal of Shanks, or at the very least he's surpassed the Shanks that we first met in Fuchsia Village. So it would be really cool to see Luffy inherit that position and show us just how far he's come in the most simple of ways. But our second half of the crew are skipping the underworld of Elbaf and riding a lovely rainbow up to the second, which is a series of frankly stunning drawings. And something that Oda does really well is capture the overwhelming brightness of the rainbow, which I believe is made of Sunstone, which we'll discuss in a second. But when we cut to the faces of Bonnie and Robin looking at it, their faces are illuminated like they're looking at the greatest treasure in the world. Having brought up Bonnie, I think she's a very underrated highlight of this chapter because Elbaf is her first carefree adventure. This is the first island she's been to without having to worry about sunlight, the world government apprehending her, and of course the ever-depressing status of her father. Now that all of that has been resolved, Bonnie has the freedom to enjoy the adventure, and that's really lovely to see. She is finally traveling the world with Kuma just as the two of them had always dreamed. Now the rainbow itself is of course a reference to the Bifrost, which is said to be a burning rainbow bridge that connects Midgard to Asgard. And I don't know if Norse mythology ever offers an explanation as to what the Bifrost is made out of, but Oda does, mentioning that it is made out of painter, which is a concept that actually caused a bit of translation controversy with the last chapter, because the scans completely dropped the ball with this. But painter was actually mentioned by Stanson when he and Harridan were figuring out how to carry the creature they'd just slain, assumedly to feed it to the Straw Hat Pirates. But in that chapter, it was revealed that painter is a substance also known as Sunstone. And any time that the concept of sun and light is mentioned, then we should be paying attention. But given that Elbaf is the first time that we've heard of this Sunstone, I would assume that it's unique to Elbaf. Kind of like how the Sea Stone was unique to Wano before it spread throughout the world. And it's yet another one of those elements that points to Elbaf potentially being the origin of the original sun god, because everything seems to be named after the sun. They have their own sun god. Dory and Broggy have a sun shield, a sun saw. Now we have Sunstone, and even the wood from the treasure tree Adam was used to create the Thousand Sunni. So this may not be the arc where we learn more about Joy Boy, because if anything, it feels like we are going even further back than that, to the core mythology of the sun god that that started everything. And then on Laugh Tale, once we learn the true history, we'll fill that very Joy Boy shaped gap. I'm really glad that we got to see this whole section though. As much as I did like what Oda did by stealthing us onto Elbaf and breaking out of the diorama and seeing the real thing, I do really appreciate being able to take in the whole island from afar and the majestic ride up the rainbow. But we then cut back to Luffy's group, and this is Luffy's group again because he's back after a chit chat with one of the most dangerous men to have ever existed in the world, and I love how this plays out, even if the results are potentially quite terrifying, because Luffy runs into Gerd and Goldberg and they naturally ask him, "Mate, what were you doing in that there underworld? Not a good place to be." And Luffy is now bound by a promise that he made to Loki, which leads him to lie. And it's always amazing whenever Luffy tries to lie because he's just physically incapable of it. Every time he tries, his face contorts and what we see is like a child trying to do the mental maths of how much trouble he's in. But very cleverly, Oda has Goldberg take this as a sign of trauma, as if whatever Luffy experienced in the fearsome underworld is what's causing this reaction. And it seems like a very small thing, but making a situation like this happen requires so much groundwork. And assumedly, it's because Luffy's gonna do something objectively stupid in the future, like freeing Loki, something that he would be immediately talked out of by anyone with a modicum of reason. But for this narrative bomb to go off, Oda needs to give those around Luffy a valid alibi for him, but also not have Luffy state it to anyone who directly knows him, because any of the crew would immediately pick up on the poor deception that he's trying to implement. And that's a very hard thing for authors to do, to skillfully move and place and juggle certain characters and make impending disasters like this seem both natural and unstoppable. And then we also bring Mr. Road back into things, which, look, I'm honestly kind of sick of him already. However, I do think that there's room for redemption. If I cast my mind back to characters like Caesar Clown, he was also someone who I started to get a bit sick of. However, he definitely grew on me a lot over time, and Oda is usually very good at taking these weird minor villains and making them quite endearing. Haven't gotten to that stage with Road yet. He's very much just gone full weirdo now, mask off, quite literally, and now he's all about that deranged long tongue. But I will say that Gerd and Road do have one thing in common though, which is that they both have a bit of a thing for humans. In this chapter, Gerd finds Luffy very cute, which is the socially acceptable way of expressing Road's feelings, which manifested as more of a human kink as soon as he saw Nami. And Gerd's enjoyment of humans also leads to a pretty big dub for Sanji, because in the montage of close-ups you can see him cuddling up to her chest, and it looks surprisingly peaceful. It's not the usual Sanji pervertedness, which I think is character development. It almost looks a bit natal, like a child cozying up to its mother. So maybe Sanji's working out some other issues at the moment, don't know. But what I do know is that if this had happened right after the Straw Hats reunited, then I have no doubt that Sanji would have had a fatal nosebleed at the very sight of Gerd. The best close-up of this chapter definitely goes to Usopp though. When he and Luffy finally arrive in the Elbaf village, Usopp is in tears that this is happening. That he finally gets to cast his eyes on the island that he's admired since stepping into the Grand Line. And there's even a small flashback of a panel from chapter 129, which was the end of Little Garden, where Luffy and Usopp resolve to visit Elbaf and then start singing their made-up song about the island. So this is a huge moment for the two of them, and I also think it's very important that they're together for this initial moment, because they made a promise to visit Elbaf together, and now here they are fulfilling it. And the flashback panel is also very nice because you see a piece of the Going Merry, and any shot of the Merry is always a straight shot to the heart, especially since conflict over the Merry almost destroyed the Elbaf dream for both Luffy and Usopp. So there's a lot more going on here. It's not just, hey, we're doing the thing it is we said we do. Luffy and Usopp haven't just arrived on this island. What they've brought with them is the weight of their experiences together to get here. And on an artistic note, I always find flashback panels like this quite fun, because some manga authors with flashback, they just take their work from the previous chapter, copy paste. But Oda has a policy of always drawing panels even if they're the ones we've already seen. So at face value, this drawing looks the same, but there's a lot of very minor differences. I think that Oda does this to keep the manga feeling consistent, so that the flashback panels don't look out of place with the modern art. But I wouldn't be opposed to juxtaposing the older art, because I think it works quite well to cast our minds back to simpler times by using the simpler art style of early One Piece. That's not the only Little Garden callback though, because a very unexpected name has resurfaced again in One Piece, as we have another quote by fictional author Louis Arnote. Louis Arnote is the in-world author of Brag Men, one of the most famous and widely read books in One Piece, and this was the book that describes Little Garden, and evidently a lot of the Grand Line as well. And despite being classified as fiction romance, Brag Men appears to have been a well well-written log of the adventures of Louis Arnote. Louis Arnote is also a figure that fell victim to the Nolan treatment. He wrote his books authentically, but he was branded as a liar due to the completely outrageous nature of his stories, and we currently don't know what became of him. In fact, we don't even know when Bragman was written. My guess would be a long time ago. Definitely somewhere in between the Void Century and modern day. And if we were to look somewhere in the middle, then that would make a bit of sense, because if Louis Arnote came from the same time period as Nolan, then we do know that during that time you actually had to get permission from the world government to set sail into the Grand Line. So logging adventures during this time period was very difficult. However, according to Louis Arnote's Viviacard databook entry, he was born in the Grand Line. Very helpful because he wouldn't have needed to seek permission to be in the place it is that he already was. However, when Bragman was published, everyone in the blues would have read it and considered it to be the ravings of a man with far too much imagination, kind of like Eiichiro Oda with One Piece. But it's more likely that this book was written relatively recently, as in within the past century, because Louis Arnote refers to the giant inhabitants of Little Garden, assumedly Dorian Brook. He says to its inhabitants, this island truly is a little garden. But Bragman is a very famous book, and it has appeared elsewhere in One Piece as well. For example, we actually saw a copy of Bragman in Robin's Flashback. It was one of the many books that was saved during the Buster Call on Ohara, and Oda even gives Bragman its own close-up panel, which I've always found quite fascinating, because it's tempting to see this book on Little Garden and just write it off as a dramatic prop to be found in order to hype up Little Garden, but we keep coming back to it. It's also mentioned in the Ace novels. Ace and Master Use bond over it, and that's important because it means that Bragman isn't a story restricted to one part of the world, which was not the case with Lion Noland. That story was well known only in North Blue. But Bragman is known all over the world, and in Japan there's even an officially licensed One Piece themed gym called Bragman, where you can do all sorts of One Piece workouts. It looks like a really cool place. It's in Shibuya, and their website does have a page specifically for foreign visitors if you wanted to check it out while you're in Japan. But it is interesting that the only two times we've heard quotes from Louis Arnote are in relation to giants. So I wonder if he had something of a special interest in their culture. But in this case, his quote ends quite ominously, because his review of Elbaf is what I would describe as mixed to positive, with a key warning of not staying on the island for too long. Now, when traveling, I've received similar warnings before. For example, when I went to Iceland, I was told not to stay in Reykjavik for too long. However, that's because it's quite a mini city, and you can see pretty much all of it in a single day, so there's no real reason to stay there, and there's a lot more to explore in Greater Iceland. But I don't get the same feeling from this warning. This feels like more of a, look, if you stay too long, then bad things are gonna happen kind of warning. And the words from Louis Arnote are coupled with another shot of our silhouetted Elbaf figure, and this is so easy to miss, because you have this really cool shot of the Elbaf landscape with the funky bear, and then right down here is our one silhouetted man guy. And after having seen this, it is practically guaranteed that this is the same man who was drinking with Crocus on the cover of chapter 631. It was a bit vague when we initially saw this guy on Elbaf, but that ambiguity is gone, replaced by different ambiguity of the guy that we don't know who he is. But at least we know it's the guy who we don't know who he is. But my guess is that he saw the giant warrior pirate sailing up the rainbow, and now he's gotten up to greet the Straw Hats that he's been waiting ever so patiently for. But I really need to emphasize this. This is an almost 14-year-old mystery that we are about to have solved imminently. This is very exciting. I cannot wait to find out who this is. But right now, all we can confirm is that he is not a giant, because he's dwarfed by these very basic flowers of Elbaf. And I do wonder how long this figure has spent on Elbaf, and how much of the advice of Louis Arnote that he's followed about not staying too long. But also, on that note, I really have to wonder how Oda is going to take this advice given by one of his fictional characters, because Louis Arnote said not to stay on this island for too long, but I can't help but feel that we're in for at least 2 more years on Elbaf, at least with the current publishing schedule. At the moment, 2 years of One Piece equates to approximately 64 chapters, and Egghead Island ended after 68 chapters. And unless we're gonna have almost nothing to do on this island, I can't see Elbaf being shorter than Egghead. So it's all good and well for Mr. Fictional Author to warn us about spending too much time here, but my prediction at this stage is that we're gonna have to ignore that and get very comfortable for what may not be the longest, but what will definitely be the biggest adventure that this series has to offer. Pretty sure we finally revealed how Shanks made it to Marineford so quickly. My dude used the Rainbow Bridge. I think that's an amazing idea. The current theory for Shanks' fast travel is that he utilizes the undersea currents, which aren't policed by the Marines or the world government because they're just too dangerous. However, if Shanks does have access to Sunstone technology, which Broggy says is nothing particularly special for them, I guess. For the rest of the world, this is revolutionary, because if Shanks had Sunstone, then this dude is painting rainbows and flying them all over the world. Who's gonna stop him? Just how many pirates or Marines are even capable of sky travel? The answer is almost none. That's why the Thousand Sunnies capabilities are a big deal, and that's why Big News Morgans is also in such a great position because of his bird balloon, and of course it's why the Vegapunks are currently safe, because they know that they're incredibly unlikely to be found by anyone in the next couple of centuries because they're floating around in the sky. So Shanks using these rainbows could be like him taking a flight where everyone else has to travel by sea. It's such a huge advantage, and it makes stuff like the red line seem like a joke. Because what, is a big wall? Dude, I can paint a rainbow over it, no big deal. Of course, this isn't anywhere near guaranteed, but something that I would love to see by the end of this arc is for the Straw Hats to attain some Sunstone and have the Thousand Sunny travel across the seas by rainbow. Loki must have said something very convincing to make Luffy consider helping him after insulting Shanks. I mean, we do know that they made a deal, which is it's very concerning. And the initial deal that Loki offered was to destroy a pirate crew of Luffy's choosing upon release, which I don't know if that's the kind of thing that Luffy would go for. He's very much more simple-minded. If there is a crew that he does want to beat, then mate, just go off and do it yourself. Remove the middleman. So I have to believe that Loki offered something else. And just like Luffy, it could have been painfully simple. Something like, you free me and I'll give you a ton of delicious giant meat. Which could be a bit of a twist on the typical arc opening where Luffy feeds someone and then decides to put his life on the line for that generosity. So Luffy may have to reckon with the idea that the person who gave him food is somehow not good. Although looking back on the chapter, there is a big sign that the crew should have picked up on, which is when Luffy reunited with them. He said, hey guys, the village is on this level, and no one questioned how Luffy knew that. We know that Luffy knows because Loki told him, but this should have been a huge red flag for the other crew members, because why would Luffy ever know where anything is? To be fair to them, they're probably all just a bit overwhelmed right now. Usopp's way too excited to be on Elbaf in general, and Chopper's clearly sharing that excitement. Sanji is a bit too enamored with Gerd, so if Zoro and Nami aren't paying attention, then mate, everything is hopeless. But back to Loki's original offer, you know what kind of scallywag would take up this destruction deal? That's right, Eustace Kid. He has such a massive grudge against the Red Hair Pirates, and after suffering a second humiliating defeat to them, he really could just say F it and decide to invoke Ragnarok for the sake of taking revenge. I guess the idea being that he could commandeer the key to Loki's cuffs from Luffy, and that would save Luffy from being viewed as the objective bad guy in the situation, because if Luffy does free Loki, then mate, it's gonna be hard to recover from that, unless Loki himself does turn out to be a pretty decent guy, in which case, good job. And I do think that Oda likes to keep Luffy quite pure, so even if he's made a deal that involves freeing Loki, the situation feels primed for some nefarious figure to step in and alter the deal. If not Eustace Kid, then an Orochi or Spandam-like opportunist, so maybe even someone like Road. He's deranged enough to do something like this, and he believes quite strongly in giant supremacy where strength dictates all of existence, so he could very much end up screwing us all over once again. I do suggest you look up Sunstone and what real-life Vikings use it for. Good suggestion, let's do it. So Sunstone is a mineral that is mentioned in medieval Icelandic texts, which is said to have allowed their wielders to locate the sun on an overcast day, as well as even tell the time by using it as something of a sundial. And this was a substance that was said to be so effective that even after the invention of the magnetic compass, Icelandic sailors said nah mate and favored the use of the sunstone. And it's not confirmed, but it is suspected that the actual substance this refers to is Iceland spar, a chunk of which was found in the wreckage of a medieval Icelandic ship in 2002. Although I should say that the alternative theory posed as to why this spar was found is that the sailors were using it as a paperweight. So this could be a case of historians believing that history was much more magical than it really was. Doesn't really matter because Oda has definitely gone down the more magical and adventurous path for his Sunstone, and I like that. I really hope our mystery man isn't Shiki. Alright, this could age horribly, but I am so looking forward to the idea of finally being able to put the Shiki idea to bed. We tuck it in, we say goodnight, and then we smother it with a pillow. There are a lot of people who still insist that this is obviously Shiki because of the colors used in the digitally colored manga, which does mostly match Shiki's design. But the thing to keep in mind is that Oda doesn't choose these colors. The work for these minor characters gets assigned to colorists, who are allowed to work at their own discretion, and that's why very few characters in the digitally colored manga are introduced with their actual color schemes. So that's my warning with just assuming that this is Shiki. The colors aren't canon until Oda draws them in person. And of course, I'm hoping that it's not Shiki, but it is still a possibility, especially since we've seen a lot of the animals from Strong World on Elbaf, so that could be a pretty big hint that he's been here the entire time. At the moment, I'm not sure what we'd achieve by reintroducing Shiki of all people though, as opposed to finally getting to meet someone like Scopper Gaban, because the other thing we need to remember is that this person was actually friendly with Crocus, and Shiki would have had to have a radical personality overhaul for these sorts of pleasantries to be exchanged. Are we going to talk about Elbaf's third realm, Heaven? Considering the mythology behind the island, what if this is their form of Valhalla? You know, I suppose we could talk about it. It's definitely the realm that I'm currently most keen to see, and if I had to make a prediction, I would say this is probably going to be the place where the final climax of the arc happens. Considering that you've got Loki claiming to be a sun god and Luffy who doesn't claim to be a sun god but just is one anyway, it feels like the most appropriate place for this showdown to happen is Heaven, Valhalla, the realm of the gods, whatever we want to call it. And we have done scenarios like this before, but never quite this literally. The first was Luffy versus Enel in the sky, when we smacked a false god down, but Dressrosa also had quite a similar ending because Luffy defeated Doflamingo in the sky and gave that false deity world noble a taste of delicious crunch some earth. And the other thing to think about is that Elbaf is eventually going to have its own countdown to destruction. Realistically, that probably won't happen until late next year or even 2026, but every arc now has its own island destroying threat that needs to be stopped. Or something similar to Onigashima crashing into the flower capital of Wano, the Buster on Egghead, Big Mom's rampage on Totolan, seizes chemical weapon, etc. So maybe the countdown to destruction on Elbaf is going to involve its 3 tiers, and having them gradually engulfed by Ragnarok until everyone's right at the top and there is nowhere left to run. I find it funny that part of Louis Arnote's review talks about how much of a shame it would be to not explore Elbaf. Almost feels like this review is what convinced Oda to do this arc in the first place. These words do feel like Oda talking to himself. The fact that Louis Arnote concedes that, it would be a great shame not to visit Elbaf, because just in case you're not aware, we're not supposed to be here right now. Oda was actually planning on skipping Elbaf and moving forwards. If you want to know more about that, I have a whole video detailing what happened and why, but with this in mind, these words do hit a lot harder, as if Oda is reinforcing himself, saying, yeah, I gotta do this, but then there's also the warning at the end, like, we're gonna do this, but let's not linger too long. That could also be Oda talking to himself. Yes, we're going to visit, but please don't stay too long. We can't afford to have another Wano-length vacation here, because we've got work to do, and I'd like to finish this series sometime this decade. Look, by One Piece standards, it's pretty unlikely that the crew will spend too much time on Elbaf, considering that most arcs are done and dusted in a day or two of in-world time, although there is the exception of Wano where we spent almost a month on that island. But this isn't just Oda trying to give himself a warning or set expectations for the readers. There is an in-world reason why people shouldn't stop at this island for too long. And I've got 2 ideas as to why. One is reasonable and the other is not. The first idea is that this island is so colossal that it may screw with the log pose, and if you don't leave quickly enough, it could render you unable to reach the next island, which may actually tie into the idea of the aforementioned Sunstone, and that might be another reason why giants carry it, to use it for navigational purposes where poses are no longer good enough. But thinking back to Little Garden, this island was a huge problem because it took 1 year for the log pose to reset, and according to Dory and Broggy, no human was able to last that full year on Little Garden. And if we're talking about scaling things up to some sort of big garden, then maybe a reset on Elbaf doesn't take too long from the perspective of a giant, but for a human, the reset could be their entire lifespan, and so you really don't want your tools to be locked into Elbaf's magnetic forces. Although I do admit that a similar thing happening on Elbaf wouldn't feel like a huge problem, because we have so many allies who can help us. The giant warrior pirates, the new giant warrior pirates, we can just set sail with them from anywhere. So that's what brings me to my probably wrong but much more interesting and devastating idea, which is that time passes differently on Elbaf, and each day spent on this island equates to many more days or even more units of measurements beyond that in the outside world. So if you were to spend too much time here, then you could leave to find that the outside world has completely changed. That's the sort of thing that this warning takes my mind to, because a similar concept has been referenced in One Piece before, which is the Tamate box on Fishman Island. This item actually comes from the Urashimatara folktale, where he visited the dragon palace of a mermaid princess, but time passed differently within the palace, and when Urashimatara returned, everyone he knew had grown old and died. And that was the purpose of the Tamate box itself. It was said to store Urashimatara's aging during the time he spent at the dragon palace. He was told never to open it, but of course he did open the box, and all of that age, it ravaged him instantly. So I want to emphasize that this is an unlikely idea and I wouldn't put too much stock into it, but at this stage I'm not quite sure what else would warrant a warning like this, especially for the Straw Hats, because they're realistically strong enough, smart enough, and have enough utility in every field to overcome whatever problems this island could throw at them. And it does bring up some potentially interesting time-related ideas. Firstly, the silhouetted figure. If time passes differently on Elbaf, then this guy could be from the Void Century for all that we know. Secondly, if we did encounter Eustace Kid again, it would be fun for him to have spent a long time from his perspective on this island, maturing and growing more powerful, because it's very possible that Eustace Kid is actually somewhere in the underworld, because what else would they would have done with him? He tried to attack the island, so you know what, mate, he gets punished and imprisoned in the traditional way. Thirdly, time-based shenaniganry could also explain why Shanks took so long to finally take his island back from Bartolomeo, because it took a whole month from the time that Bartolomeo landed there to when Shanks arrived to stop him. So maybe having that drink on Elbaf with a couple of old friends for the afternoon equated to a couple of weeks. And fourthly, I kind of like the idea of time passing differently, because it's a perfect reflection of how slowly time passes in the One Piece world compared to the real world it is that I think we're all in. Because a couple of days in the One Piece story can be years for us, and that could serve as another warning for Oda himself. Let's say he wants to spend a day on Elbaf. Well, we need to take that very seriously, because that one day could be 2 years of real world time. And speaking of, there was another question about that. What makes you think Elbaf will be over in 2 years? Honestly, I'm not convinced that it will be over in 2 years. But from my perspective, 2 years is the minimum length it would need. And I'm mostly thinking about this from a publishing perspective. Talking about One Piece arcs in years is a bit tricky, because different arcs have taken place in different time periods of Oda's workflow. For a shocking example of this, let's compare Dressrosa and Egghead Island, because both of these arcs took approximately the same amount of real world time to complete, which is 2 and a bit years. To be more precise, Dressrosa was a couple of months longer, but not long enough to explain the extreme chapter differential. Because Egghead Island took 2 and a bit years to publish its 68 chapters, whilst Dressrosa took 2.5 years to publish its 102 chapters. So you can see that that's a pretty drastic workflow decrease over time, and that's of course due to the increased breaks for Oda's health as well as his work on other One Piece projects. So that's why I use the 2-year number. Because Elbaf, it's not going to be published at the Dressrosa rate, and if it's the same as the Egghead rate, then we've got 2 years at minimum. The only way this doesn't happen is if Elbaf ends up being around 30 chapters, but I don't know, man. We're already 6 chapters into it, 1/6 of the way to that 30 number, and we are not even close with being done with the setup on what is the largest island we will ever go to. I just don't see 30 chapters being long enough to explore the island itself, just explore, let alone get to know its people, its problems, and solve those problems. So I think that Egghead length is probably our minimum, but if it's a bigger story than Egghead, then we could realistically be looking at 3 or even 4 years. It all really does depend on what Oda wants this arc to be. This is everything I hoped it would be and so much more. Oda has outdone himself, and as much as we should welcome back the magnificent Jaguar D Saul, we should also say that he's not doing a whole lot to beat the allegations of being the man with the burn scars. So this chapter starts with 3 whole pages of Robin flashback, and it's just like, mate, the audacity of this author to take what is one of the most heartbreaking flashbacks in the series and release DLC for it 19 years later. For some context, Robin's flashback was the first flashback that I read weekly when I caught up during any sobby. This was way back in 2005, and it destroyed me back then as a 16-year-old, and seeing more of it destroys me all over again now as a 35-year-old. Especially the part when we see that Robin has drawn O'Hara onto a map in a book. It's just tragic. Because what else can you do as a child? You don't want the legacy of your entire civilization to be erased, but more than that, I imagine this is part of not wanting to face the reality that you, 8-year-old girl, are now alone. If Robin accepts this book, then that is accepting the fact that Ohara has been destroyed and she has nothing. So at every possible opportunity, she's trying to make for to reinforce that Ohara lives on, not just for the world, but for herself. So what Oda does here is he very efficiently packs in as much cruelty as he possibly can in these 3 pages. People think that Eiichiro Oda is a nice man. He isn't, at least not judging by what's happening here. Because another example is Robin eating garbage with a stray dog. And this is very manipulative because it's usually a lot easier to make people feel bad about animals than it is for their fellow humans. We're quite desensitized to human violence and suffering, so putting child Robin next to the stray dog allows Oda to hit us with that more effective gut punch, to take the emotion that people feel for the dog and apply it to Robin. And all of this is before we get to something I never expected to see, which is Robin genuinely contemplating leaving this world of her own volition. I have to say it like that because YouTube age restricts videos that uses the S word, which I recently discovered on one of my Hunter x Hunter videos on New World Review when talking about a character who got involved in a situation where that word may or may not have been applicable. This is such a rough start to a One Piece chapter though. However, I really appreciate it for 2 reasons. The first is because One Piece is at its core a goofy pirate manga, and contrasting that every now and then with incredibly dark and serious moments like this allows those moments to have the impact they should. To think that this character who we love, this character who we always see joking around, was once driven to this point is so powerful, and it adds a lot to Robin's journey. Whenever I reread Water 7 or Any Sobby again, Robin's decision to sacrifice herself for the Straw Hats is going to make an unfortunate amount of sense, because she's been seriously considering leaving this world since she was a child, and the point at which that became an easy decision for her to make was as soon as she had people that she wanted to protect, and from her perspective, people who would benefit from her death. And of course, it also makes her saying, "I want to live," hit so much harder, because she's been told that she needs to live by Saul, by her mother, by Professor Clover, but never truly known or felt why up until that point. I hate it. I hate it a lot, but I love it. It's really good. And I do unfortunately believe that this was quite necessary for Oda to re-torture us like this, because I'm going to mention the big number again, but it's been 19 years since Robin's Flashback was first published. In that time, people have been born, they've pissed their pants, gone through puberty, done other things to pants, completed high school, and started university with a clean pair of pants. So a whole generation has been born and grown into adulthood since Robin's Flashback. And that's a very tricky thing for an author to tackle, because the big event of this chapter, Robin's reunion with Saul, is entirely dependent on being able to empathize with Robin's experience. So in order to do that, Oda needed to reopen those old wounds, so that her pain would be fresh in our minds right before one of the best and most heartwarming things to ever happen in this series happened. After Robin's extended flashback, there is a bit of a palate cleansing as we continue to marvel at everything about Elbaf, which at this point has to be the most magical and majestic island we've ever visited and likely ever will visit. We've got ships sailing through clouds, beach paradises naturally forming in trees, and mountains upon mountains of infinite meat. At the moment, this is nothing short of paradise. And we haven't even reached the 3rd level yet, where I imagine things get truly heavenly. But because of Oda in that last chapter, thank you, Oda, I can't look at all of this without that small sense of dread building up in the back of my mind. Because in the very last chapter, we were warned by a fictional author not to overstay our welcome on this island. At the moment, that's going to be pretty difficult because this welcome is unparalleled. So I'm just waiting for the dark twist to drop. Like on Dressrosa, which seems like a delicious Spanish paradise until we learned about all of its horrific issues. But something I love is that Road is present for all of this amazing stuff, but he's been crucified, and it appears that he's currently going through the penance phase of minor villains, which is Oda's transitional phase into making them palatable characters again. A really good example of this happening in the past would be Caesar Clown, who did some properly despicable things on Punk Hazard, but then during Dressrosa, Zoe, and Whole Cake Island, he became a literal punching bag. He spent his time in purgatory and then went on to be rehabilitated as a character who we can now laugh at and enjoy. That looks to be the road that Road is roading. He's got some suffering to go through, a lot of suffering, but eventually we'll be able to stand his presence again, but only after laughing at a lot, and I mean a lot, of his pain. We've also got Sanji still in Gerd's hands and conjuring hearts towards her, but it's just like, Sanji, mate, what would you even do if Gerd Gerd was interested. You'd just be parking your bicycle in an airplane hangar. It's not gonna work. But something very exciting is that we don't waste any time here at all. We get straight into the Big Mom connection, and the Giants have heard about the news of her defeat during the raid, which means that they should recognize Eustace Kid, and I wonder if that complicates matters with him at all, and that perhaps maybe they might have shown Kid some leniency because of it. Like after fishing his prone metal corpse out of the ocean, did they suddenly realize that this is the man who brought down one of their most hated enemies, and as a reward sent him upwards to the astral world, which is the official name for the highest tier of Elbaf? We have the underworld, the sun world, and the astral world. And previously I did wonder about Kid being sent to the underworld, but it would be a fun subversion if they realized who he was and basically gave him a ticket to heaven for bringing down their age-old enemy. And Gerd also mentions that Big Mom was once a friend of hers, and this is very true, because if you go back to Big Mom's flashback in chapter 866, there is this adorable panel of a very young Gerd running away from the 5-year-old Charlotte Linlin, which, like everything on Elbaf so far, really messes with my sense of scale, because here Big Mom is 5 years old, but Gerd is 12, and yet she looks 5. And what I'm not really sure about is how Gerd feels about this whole Big Mom situation. The way Oda draws her does seem quite empathetic towards her old friend, as if Gerd feels really bad about what happened with Linlin and may know that it wasn't, necessarily her fault, but due to the seriousness of the crime committed, she has to abide by the excommunication. But all of this is being put on hold because there is some exceptionally important Robin business that needs to be seen to. And look, this chapter, it might not be the most hype of the year. It didn't come packed with devastating lore drops or crazy introductions, insane action, all of, the One Piecey stuff. But I think this moment is, without exaggeration, one of, if not the best One Piece moment of the year. And I also feel like the stupidest person in the world for not predicting how this was going to go down. When Oda first hit us with the idea that Saul had fallen and wouldn't get up, I foolishly took that seriously, as did the rest of the Straw Hat crew, with Chopper ready to jump in and do some doctoring. But it was as if there was some story need to keep Saul out of the way for now, and that a reunion would be delayed until whatever problem that happens on Elbaf was solved. But what happened instead is infinitely better than that, and it's a direct callback to how Robin and Saul first met in chapter 392, where he tried to scare her after washing up on the beach and failed miserably. And in this chapter, Saul even made sure to position himself in the water on a beach just to perfectly recreate this. Which, by the way, I'm convinced that is the one and only reason why there's a beach on Elbaf. It's because Oda wanted this moment, and so to make it happen, he came up with this really creative but kind of convoluted explanation as to how a beach can exist. But there is so much to love about this. One thing is that at every single point of this reunion, Robin's attitude and mannerisms have stepped back to her 8-year-old self. And we can see this in very simple actions like the way that Robin stands with her hands behind her back, which is absolutely adorable to see Robin's adult self doing. And in general, Robin just feels so youthful and vibrant, much more so than we've ever seen her before. Seeing Saul again has allowed Robin to access a state of happiness and innocence that she hasn't been able to reach for 22 years. And I don't want to say that seeing Saul erases all of the pain and suffering over the past 2 decades, but right here in this moment, that pain doesn't exist. What we're seeing here is pure Robin. And there is one point where this almost breaks, which is when Saul mentions all of those horrible, horrible things that they've been saying about Robin. But Robin quickly bottles all of that up because understandably, she just wants to stay in this space. It's not going to last forever. All of her experiences are going to catch up to her again and she'll become the Robin that we know. But for now, just let her have this. And all of the tears that came afterwards definitely got me, and as stated before, that's very much thanks to Oda's opening 3 pages. He really had to crank up the emotional pressure in order to make a release like this land, and my favorite part of this situation is because for the lifespan of One Piece, this has been a very tragic laugh. It's something that Robin did in her darkest times to survive. But after today, the meaning of that laugh has completely changed. It's now a laugh of celebration and warmth and so many other good words. And this whole part of the chapter serves a lot more than just Robin and Saul. It's a celebration of Ohara. It's not just about Robin's suffering, it is about everything that was sacrificed on that day living on. Not literally, I guess except in the case of Saul, but the voices of the past have been heard thanks to Vegapunk, and the legacy of Ohara has now been redrawn back into the history books. But then the line that gets everyone, obviously, is when Robin says, "Praise me for being alive," because that's what she was told to do by everyone around her, Saul, her mother, Clover, which is something that Robin didn't understand why for quite some time. Why do I need to live? Why not just end it all? But Robin did it anyway. And I think it's only fair that Saul at the very least says, "Good job." And even though Oda didn't plan on this arc happening, Elbaf is such an appropriate place for Robin and Saul to see each other, because when speaking to younger Robin, Saul described the giants of Elbaf as, quote, savages, because he's from a different tribe of giants out in the world somewhere, and you wouldn't expect such a soft, emotional scene to be happening on the island of savages on Warland. So there's a very nice juxtaposition here. And look, I didn't know what to expect with a Robin and Saul reunion, because this sort of thing, it's just never happened before. Not once in 27 years has a Straw Hat been able to meet their treasured mentor, and to be fair, that's primarily because most of them are dead. But what I felt from Saul and Robin is like a preview of what to expect when Luffy does finally meet Shanks again. These two figures who have gone their separate ways for so long coming back together, and Shanks praising Luffy for keeping his promise of becoming a great pirate. Although at the moment, what I'm looking forward to much more is Luffy's interaction with Saul, because Luffy insists that as the captain, he needs to extend pleasantries to the people who have helped his crewmates. And this is one of the few times where Luffy has acted like a more traditional captain, but it's more than that. This is an act of family, which we saw with Ace when he sought out Shanks in the New World just so that he could thank him for helping Luffy. Ace, as the older brother, felt the responsibility to go all the way to Shanks just to say that, and I think that Luffy definitely feels that same sense of responsibility here with Robin and Saul. And Robin knows Luffy so well because she's surprised that Luffy even remembers her story. And actually, so am I, because this means that Robin actually told everyone this story at some point. During any Sobby, the Robin flashback was portrayed as Robin reminiscing, unlike Nami's flashback, which was told to the crew by Nojiko, even the parts that she wasn't there for somehow. And just on the topic of memory, it's also very well worth noting that Luffy remembered Harridan's name earlier, which is a big deal for many reasons. Firstly, because even if you do remember his name, far too many people in the English fan base still can't pronounce it. I always hear people saying Hajrudin, so just pretend the J isn't there and you'll be fine. But secondly, this shows that Luffy on some level has accepted Harridan. Even though he makes it very clear that he still has no interest in subordinates, it takes a lot for Luffy to remember someone's name. It's a lot rarer than you may think, and he usually just gives people nicknames based on what they look like. So actually learning Harridan's name is a sign of acceptance. But speaking of names, this is another meeting of D's. Luffy probably won't care, or if most, there'll be a tiny piece of curiosity when he discovers that this man is named Jaguar D. Saul. Although whether he cares or not, whenever Luffy meets another member of the D clan, absolutely world-changing chaos follows. The first time this happened was unknowingly so, but it was meeting Nefertari D. Vivi leading to the events of Alabasta. But Luffy meeting Marshall D. Teach and Trafalgar D. Law also resulted in their own respective storms, so I'm incredibly keen to see what sort of storm Monkey D. Luffy cooks up with Jaguar D. Saul. For now though, this was a very chill chapter. Very much the opposite of a storm, and it's quite unusual for Oda to end a chapter in this way. Usually he adds a hook at the end, something to make it impossible for readers to not want to immediately turn the page. And this usually comes in the form of a question that needs answering. Like when Loki was introduced, that naturally brought up a lot of questions about who he is, why he's here, and what he's gonna do. Or in the chapter right after that, which ended with the announcement of Saul's collapse, and the question of what that could mean, as well as the chapter after that, with the quote from Louis Arnote bringing up the question of why we shouldn't overstay our welcome on Elbaf. But this chapter doesn't even dare to ask us that next question. And rightfully so, because it would take so much away from this moment. I've brought up this number a lot in this chapter, but Robin's separation from Saul has almost played out in real world time. It's been 19 years since Robin's flashback was published, and 22 years since those events in World. So we as readers have been waiting for this almost as long as the actual characters have. And I think it was definitely the right decision by Oda not to take attention away from it and just leave the end as a well-earned celebration of survival. I feel like Gerd mentioning Big Mom's betrayal is a foreshadow that Luffy will do something similarly unforgivable. I agree, and I do think that we know what this thing is going to be already. It's very Loki related. But going back to Gerd's dialogue for a bit, the way it sounds is if she personally has forgiven Linlin for killing Jorel, because it arguably wasn't her fault, it was whatever hunger demon that resides within her. However, Gerd is powerless to do anything about it because of the weight of the laws of Elbaf and the opinions of the other giants being too great to stand against. With that said, I am very nervous about this whole Luffy-Loki situation, because it is going to take all all of Eiichiro Oda's authoristic powers to convince me that this isn't by far the stupidest and most damaging thing that Luffy has ever done, if he does free Loki, that is. On the one hand, I do like that Loki has managed to dissect Luffy and appeal to him in his own unique way. That's the very least that you would expect of someone who carries the name Loki, which comes with that expectation of deception. And of every crew member, Luffy's mind is probably the most susceptible to mild deception. Chopper might also be in there. And I guess in the case of a woman, Sanji can be quite easily taken in, but it is going to take some real writing magic to keep me on Luffy's side here if he does this. But whether he does this exact thing or not, I do think that Luffy is going to go down the unforgivable path. Even if the unforgivable thing it is that he does isn't his fault, or even if he didn't do it and he's being framed for the thing. In fact, especially those two. For example, this would never happen, but can you imagine if Luffy accidentally killed Jorel, who is the 408-year-old former companion of Jorel that Charlotte Lin killed, and then we would have a direct unforgivable act comparison. It would be a very, very quick way to establish that Luffy is now despised on the same level as Big Mom. And if it did happen, the way I imagine it going is more likely to be something along the lines of Luffy frees Loki, and then Loki goes on to kill Jorel. But because Luffy was responsible for letting Loki go within giant society, that is tantamount to carrying out the killing yourself. And maybe this could play into the warning from Louis Arnote, because there may be a whole series of acts considered to be unforgivable by the Giants. So it's best to get in and out fairly promptly, don't stay too long, don't overstay your welcome, because if you do commit one of these acts, even accidentally, mate, it is straight to the underworld for you. Should everything play out as Oda has currently set up, and that's not a guarantee, this could be a Zoe scenario where Oda is setting up false drama for an emotional subversion, but going with what he's telling us, after Luffy commits his unforgivable act, we'd probably have all of the Giants turn on the Straw Hats with the exception of Gerd, which is what the little conversation in this chapter may be seeding. Gerd may not want to make the same mistake with Luffy as she did with Lin. Plus, let's be realistic about this fiction. Gerd is a classic Oda gorgeous woman, and those almost always end up as allies pretty quickly. In fact, the prettier they are, the pretty quickly they switch sides. That and Saul, I can't see Saul standing against them, especially because he doesn't necessarily subscribe to the customs of Elbaf. To bring this up again, in Robin's flashback, he described the Elbaf Giants as savages. So that was either a pretty heavy hit of prejudice on his part, not cool Saul, or we still have yet to see the aspects of this society that Saul considered savage. Because everything really is going far too well at the moment. Elbaf is this magical wonderland, and I just don't know if I trust it. It should be said that during most Kingdom arcs, Luffy is made an enemy of the monarchy or whoever happens to be in charge at the time. Usually it's someone who's usurped the rightful ruler, and it just so happens that in most cases that entity happens to be the direct antagonist. But even on Fishman Island, where the royalty were friendly to us initially, there was conflict caused by Charlie's prophecy, and they also get suspected of performing all the kidnappings that were happening. So at the very least, there's probably going to be some giant misunderstanding that the crew have committed an unforgivable act. But what's weird is that we both have and have yet to meet the monarchy of Elbaf. We've met Prince Loki and Prince Haradin, and their father the king was killed, so no need to meet him, but you do need to ask, in lieu of all of them, who is actually ruling over Elbaf at the moment? There's a whole tier of what I assume to be giant nobility that we have yet to explore, and if they reflect most nobility that we've encountered in One Piece, then their views could be where the savagery that Saul was referring to emanates from. You missed the most important / shocking detail of the chapter. Robin's reunion was so important that Luffy consciously puts off eating until after it. He did, although it's not the first time that something like this has happened. Luffy also put off the crew toast for Jinbe on Onigashima because Luffy felt that it was more important to celebrate with everyone else after they defeated Kaido. And I say this all the time, and I will until it happens, but to this day, Luffy still hasn't done the toast, and I think that Jinbe is just far too polite to ask for one. Not a great example because that event, it never happened in the end, but Luffy does prioritize his crew and his friends over these sorts of events. And in this individual case, it's because from Luffy's perspective, I think it's more important that Saul is at the feast with them to share that moment. But you can see because when Luffy discovers Saul, he immediately wants to drag him back to start the feast. It wasn't just Luffy though. To me, the more shocking crew member was Zoro, who put off drinking his precious booze so that he could go to Robin's reunion. That is a big deal for the rather antisocial Zoro, who usually favors privacy both for him and other crew crew members. He's not the kind of person who likes to pry into other people's business, and he'll generally prefer to drink himself unconscious in a solitary corner somewhere. Here's the thing though, it is not about the rest of the crew. I mean, it is, but it's about them in relation to Robin. It is important for everyone to be there for this, because Saul's promise to Robin was that she would someday find a group of people who accept her for who she is. And when she does finally return to Saul, she comes equipped with each and every one of those people he said she would meet, which is an idea that would not have worked anywhere near as well if Robin went alone. Which is the other thing, Robin originally did want to go alone, but the rest of the crew wouldn't let her, which is a very sweet and slobby callback to when Robin chose to leave alone, and the crew refused to let her do so, and they went after her. So this really is hammering home that Robin has accomplished everything that Saul wanted for her, and that she will never be alone again. I'm surprised you didn't mention Saul's peg leg. Now the only stereotypical pirate feature we're missing is the eye patch. So I didn't mention it because I genuinely didn't notice it at first. My eyes were not on his legs or anyone's legs at all. For the whole second part of this chapter, my eyes were glued to the faces of Robin and Saul the entire time. And so this chapter completely defeated my peripheral vision. And just in case I'm not the only person in the world, which look, I probably am, but either way, Saul now has a peg leg prosthetic on his right leg, which is the same leg that Zeph is missing. He has a peg leg and he used it on Sanji often, meaning I guess you can say that Sanji has been thoroughly pegged. But for a series about pirates, the peg leg is an extremely rare feature, and we don't see a lot of stereotypically pirate stuff in general. The only other peg leg I can remember off the top of my head was Donald Moderate, who was an absolutely nothing character in One Piece Stampede, and the only reason why I remember him is because I was just so flabbergasted that they bothered to create, animate, and voice a character for the nothing it is that he does. But he does have a peg leg, and it's another right leg, so Oda has this definite bias with limbs. With legs, he takes the right one, and with arms, he takes the left one. The most curious thing about Saul is that yes, he has a peg leg, but he is not a pirate. So one of the only characters to have a stereotypically pirate aesthetic in this series primarily about pirates is not even a pirate. However, this leg, it could be pretty devastating, because just imagine if it was made out of atom wood. And Saul, he's not a weak guy. The dude was a vice admiral, which thinking back on it means that he knows both observation and armament haki at the very least. And the dude was strong enough to lift a whole marine battleship, so he could be seriously useful in a fight, and I do hope that we get to see more of him in that capacity. Something you said about Robin often joking made me realize this is why she has such a morbid sense of humor all the time. She's contemplated the worst, but now that she has a reason to fight and live, she jokes about the dark scenarios more often when with the crew. That is exactly it. That and Robin is a person who since the age of 8 has had to face the darkest parts of this world, and the one and only weapon she had against all of it was laughter. All she could do was dead. So at some point, look, you're just gonna start naturally laughing at all of the stuff that isn't traditionally funny. Hence why Robin's sense of humor is being somewhat skewed, and why almost all of her jokes are about predicting that someone could have died in a particularly grisly way. And the more worrying part is the fact that her imagination is so strong that I'm thinking that it's not just her imagination, and she may have actually witnessed or heard about some of these deaths during her time on the run. Wait, if the Saul bit is a callback, is Kuzan about to show up? I feel like the Blackbeard pirates and his gaggle of alcoholics have their own thing going on at the moment, but there should come a point down the line where Kuzan discovers that Saul is alive and they have some sort of reunion as well, just one not anywhere near as emotional as Robin's, because mate, trying to crack anything out of Kuzan, it's just not possible. Dude is a wall of ice. But Kuzan has his threads going on with Garp and Kobe, however to date his strongest story beats have been with Robin, Saul, Sakazuki, and the Ohara incident as a whole. But another potential similarity between Ohara and Elbaf is that they are both islands characterized by the existence of a massive ancient tree. And if Loki is going to get his way due to the Ragnarok and all that, then we could end up with the destruction of another invaluable ancient tree, which would be pretty funny in a dark way, because then we would need to save the books from Ohara again. Did anyone notice Robin's new hairstyle is similar to that of her Good Future Timeline version? So to explain this, in the SBS segments of manga volumes, Oda has gone through and drawn all of the Straw Hats in 2 alternate futures. A good timeline where everything works out, and a bad timeline where something catastrophic goes wrong and all of the crew lose their dreams as well as their will to dream their dreams. And in Robin's good timeline, she does go back to her pre-time skip hair by age 60, but not by age 40. So in this world, it might be possible that her reunion with Saul didn't happen until much later. But also, let's not neglect a bad timeline Robin. Robin. At age 60, she's also trying to reclaim that old hairstyle. It's just much harder to see because her hair is thinning and falling out. And you'd have to think that in the bad timeline, things also go horribly for Saul, because that's the whole premise of this universe. It is the worst possible case scenario for all characters. So maybe in the bad timeline, Robin does reunite with Saul, except he's a complete scumbag now. But she reclaimed her old hairstyle for whatever horrible encounter that ended up being. Although the important thing to note about bad timeline Robin is that she still lived, which after this chapter is a pretty big deal. Sure, she might be spending her life buying and selling children, but still, bad timeline Robin found a reason to live. But what I'm hoping for with current Robin and her current hairstyle is that we add a cowboy hat and truly reclaim pre-time skip Robin, and hopefully, like what's gonna happen, right, is as good as Frankie looks in his new cowboy hat, what we'll get is a moment of him giving it to Robin. It's just so perfectly set up. Is it an accident that Frankie just so happens to have gone cowboy at the same time that Robin has gone back to her old hairstyle? Almost certainly, probably, but I still want it to happen anyway. Hello, Internet Man. You have referred to Gerd as an airport hanger, and now to defend her honor, I challenge you to a Davy back fight. I'll await your answer. Alright, I stand by my statement. I accept your challenge, and I will see you in the groggy ring. I made the mistake of reading this chapter at work. Yeah, been there. So before I started doing YouTube full-time, I had a One Piece chapter policy, which was that if we were in a flashback, I would not read chapters at work or on the way to work. I would usually purposely wait until I'd gotten home because I had no idea what kind of pain that sadist Etchiro Oda wanted to inflict on me that week. And this chapter 1133 is a landmine. This would have caught me completely off guard because I was not expecting this to happen so soon. And I imagine there's a lot of people out there who have had to awkwardly explain to co-workers why they're suddenly crying deru. Why did you commission a drawing of Panda Man as a slave? Look, mates, that's because I have pandas for every occasion. Because fun fact, in every Grand Line review video for, I forget how long now, there is at least one hidden panda, sometimes not very well hidden, but at least one panda in every video, which is why I need such a variety of pandas in different in-world roles. Imagine being the person that bought that book, opening it to that page and being like, oh, what's O'Hara? And then getting murdered by the government and never knowing why. So I don't think that what I'm about to say is out of the question, but it would be really cool if sometime down the line, there was a minor character introduced who actually did read one of these books. And that could have been what prompted them to find out more. What is this O'Hara? Oh God, that's O'Hara, that's bad, and eventually lead them to do something like join the Revolutionary Army. It's not something I think would make it into the manga as a plot point, but maybe in an SBS somewhere, if Oda is asked to explain the names and backstories of miscellaneous Revolutionary Army members. Speaking of miscellaneous characters though, I didn't talk about this in the chapter video because I don't want this guy in any way associated with Robin and Saul's reunion, but there is a development in the cover story, and what we have here is Yamato encountering one of the least threatening people possible, which is Hold'em. He was one of the very first people that Luffy defeated after arriving on Wano, and he is of course a smile user because he has a lion crotch. And so you might be asking yourselves, Internet Man, if Hold'em is a smile user, shouldn't he be on our side already? And no, he isn't. Because Tama converted all of the smile users on Onigashima with the Kibidango. And our problem is that Hold'em was not on Onigashima. The last we heard of him was when he burned down Okobore Town, which means that he ditched Kaido's fire festival in favor of his own smaller but much more literal fire festival. However, this is good news because there is a pretty easy solution to this problem. Tama just has to feed Hold'em a Kibidango and he'll become her slave for a month. I do hope that this isn't the solution to the broader cover story problem though, which is that people keep mysteriously being kidnapped. I mean, I don't expect peak drama from cover stories, but it would be a bit meh if it turned out that, oh, it was Hold'em all along. I have to say though, I am happy to see that Yamato's finally kind of getting involved in the story that was set up and dedicated to Yamato. One of my channel artists put this really well. He said that up until now it feels like Yamato has been playing a game, but only opting for the side quests and ignoring the main story. Everywhere we go, people are being kidnapped and Yamato's just like, yeah, but what recipes can I learn from this fine food vendor? But in this case, Hold'em may be a red herring because he does have history with Tama and he may be targeting her specifically. In Act 1 of Wano, he was interested in her ability to tame animals, and so he might be capturing her because of that, in the hopes of rebuilding a beast army to retake Wano or something down the ladder than that. So he may be completely unconnected to the other nefarious things happening here, or he may be serving as someone's underling. Either way, who cares? Not Yamato, that's for sure. And if you want to hear about characters who are much more interesting than Hold'em, then I have literally over 1,000 videos waiting for you to watch next. Ladies and gentlemen, a second Shanks has just hit Elbaf. This chapter is madness. I genuinely cannot believe that this is actually happening. Because what's happening here is that we've confirmed one of the most out there, one of the most wackiest, one of the most crazy One Piece fan theories to have ever existed. And here that theory is in all of its canon glory, with this crimson figure staring at me with its shockingly Shank-shaped eyes. But before we get into that, the first thing to note about this chapter is something a bit more somber. It's the color spread, which I love. The giant Super Frankie is such a cool design, but this is a very bittersweet color spread, as Oda drew this in honor of Kazuki Yao, who was the voice of Frankie, and he recently announced his retirement due to health issues. I'm not going to go over everything here. There's a whole video elsewhere on the channel if you're interested, but it is a fantastic color spread, one that I think Frankie fans will be absolutely thrilled with, and a very nice tribute to someone who has lent their voice to One Piece across various characters for almost 25 years now. So once more I say thank you, Kazuki Yao, and I hope that you enjoy your retirement. But getting into the actual chapter, what we need to immediately address is Luffy and Saul. Because here, Luffy is using very not Luffy language. The way it's being described to me is that in Japanese, it sounds like Luffy is doing his best impression of a Yakuza boss, honorably thanking someone for protecting his precious underling. This Luffy is unusually formal. Off the top of my head, I can't think of another time in the series where he's been like this. And the rest of the crew can't quite figure it out either. Where's all this coming from, they're saying? Well, where all of this is coming from may have something to do with Ace when he asked Makino to teach him some etiquette, because Ace wanted to properly thank Shanks when he inevitably came across him in the New World, which of course resulted in the infamous two-arm Shanks scene in the anime. Quite the error there, although who knows? After this chapter, maybe Ace didn't even meet the real Shanks, and the anime was cleverly foreskinning things all along. But it may be the case that Luffy also asked Makino to teach him etiquette because when they were kids, Luffy was that annoying little brother who always wanted to do everything that Ace did. Like when they both started their own quote countries, and Luffy's was just a worse version of Ace's. Same thing here. Ace went off and said, I want to learn how to speak good, and he did, but Luffy followed and only picked up about 50% of it. Or the other possibility is that he may have learned this from Rayleigh, which would explain the rougher formalities because Rayleigh is more of an underworld denizen. And just in case Luffy ran into someone who took care of his crew during the time skip, Luffy may have wanted to know how to thank them properly, just like how Ace did for him. One very interesting thing that Saul says during this part is that he not only knows who Luffy is because he's a bit of a big shot, but Saul also refers to his time as a Marine, and that he well and truly understands the power of an Emperor. I find that quite interesting because it means that the Emperor system existed at least 22 years ago, which is cool because the timeline of their establishment is quite vague. And Shanks, for example, was only recognized as an Emperor 6 years ago. So this is potential fuel for the idea that there was an Emperor of the Sea before Shanks who was removed from their position for fictional reasons. The one thing I'm surprised about with Luffy and Saul is that the Will of D connection wasn't brought up, but also I'm not sure why I'm surprised. At first I thought that Robin might tell Luffy, hey Captain, this man's name is Jaguar D Saul, he has the same letter you have. But then again, Robin knows Luffy extremely well, and she may think that even though this information is extremely important to both her and Saul, it is completely irrelevant to Luffy, which it probably would be. He'd probably just go, cool, I got a D, then run off and go play with some bugs. So learning about Saul's D may have been irrelevant for Luffy. This chapter also comes packing with some closure as we now have a fairly clear path ahead for Lilith, Bonnie, and Kuma. Lilith, as expected, is going to set up shop on Elbaf, and the luggage that Jinbe was sent on a very important mission to bring, turns out it is a full Vegapunk clone replica thing. It's not a satellite, which were certain aspects of Vegapunk split off and isolated. Nah, this is a full backup, and I'm a bit conflicted about this. This does feel like one of those, logically it makes sense. Of course, Vegapunk, smartest man in the world with cloning in the building, he's gonna back himself up, but it does feel like Oda's very standard play of not committing to the dramatic finales that he writes for his characters and hitting the reset button far too casually. I am probably gonna come around to it just like I did with the satellites, but Egghead Island, it now kind of boils down to, well, all of the satellites survived, and we're gonna have a whole scientifically resurrected Stellar as well. And having this idea given to us in the same panel containing Jaguar D Saul definitely makes me feel that lack of permanency in One Piece. Although the funny thing is right now I'm currently making a video about why I quite liked that Saul survived after his false death incident, which is very odd for me because I usually hate those with a passion, but I really like how Oda handled Saul. But the other thing we should talk about in this section is Kuma, because the implication here is that, mate, he's going to be just fine as well. Lilith is going to fix him up all good, which is cool, but it means that in this section you've got potentially up to 3 dramatic sacrifices all being undone in a single chapter. And I know that at the moment there's no guarantee that Kuma will be fixed, but whenever I do think about what'll happen to Kuma and if he'll go on to live a happily ever after with Bonnie, my strong inclination is that Oda will do it. Because Kuma is a bit of a self-insert for Oda. Oda himself has 2 daughters, and you can definitely tell because every father-daughter relationship in One Piece is written with that extra layer of passion and lived experience. Rebecca and Kyros is a great example, where Luffy brought them together as the very last thing he did before leaving Dressrosa, or Pound surviving and getting to reunite with Lola and Chiffon, which also happened on Dressrosa actually. But I think that Oda is the kind of person who won't be able to bring himself to let Kuma die. Not so much because of Kuma himself and his tragedy, but because I think he'd find it very painful to have to draw Bonnie's reaction to that, because it hits too close to home, making him think of his own daughters. And I'm torn because Kuma's story, it is so strong, and this is a perfect place to wrap it up. But at the same time, this one character has been through so much that I would genuinely want to see him have the opportunity to live happily. So I don't know, we'll see how it goes. Maybe Oda will write another brilliant happy ending, or maybe he'll defy my expectations and give Kuma the going merry funeral treatment. But I'm very torn on this section of the chapter in general. I still really like the Saul outcome. I will defend that to the death. Whereas I'm a bit 50-50 about Kuma. It could work, but it could also just finish here. And then with Vegapunk, I'm not a fan of it at the moment. Although I do really like the explanation that this was the Vegapunk who visited Ohara. That was a nice little piece of logic to explain how he was casually able to sail around the planet when the world government were monitoring him so strictly. So again, torn. But something I do really like is that we're introduced to another new giant named Ripley, and my guess is that she is about Harudin's age, the generation of the new giant warrior pirates, and she goes on to inform us of some pretty radical changes that have happened on this here island within the last century. Elbaf has undergone a comparatively recent cultural shift and is, or I guess was, on the path to becoming a nation of peace, which is a very bold maneuver for a nation that officially calls itself Warland. But this cultural shift was initiated under King Harold, who was killed by Prince Loki, and all of the stuff with the 2 very special invaders at the end of the chapter aside, I think this gives us our solid island-specific problem to solve. We could be in the midst of a culture war in Elbaf, because I can't imagine that everyone is in favor of this new peaceful direction after thousands and thousands of years of being born, bred, and indoctrinated into a culture that was said to have started the very concept of war itself. It would be kind of like taking the Vikings and somehow turning them into the most peaceful nation on Earth, which actually did happen. According to the Global Peace Index, Iceland is the most peaceful nation on Earth, so you know what? Maybe we're onto something here. However, the goal of Loki and his faction may now be to bring Elbaf back to the proud nation of war that it once was. And that is potentially going to be assisted by a very familiar face, who I can't go any further into this chapter without discussing. There's a lot that happens, but this Scarlet Devil demands our attention. Having arrived at Elbaf at the end of the chapter within a, I don't even know what to call it anymore. The spell circle, I guess, because One Piece has suddenly gone very Black Clovery. Doesn't matter, because when I saw that circle, I nearly spat out my drink, and I wasn't even drinking at the time. That is how shook I was. And before we get to the figures inside, the circle itself is identical to the ones we saw summon the 5 elders on Egghead Island, or I guess the one that Saturn used to teleport and summon the other 4 elders. With one exception, the circle that we see at the end of this chapter doesn't have any numbers. The other circles all had the numbers 1 to 5, with Saturn being number 5. But I don't know what to think of this anymore, because my assumptions have changed a lot over time. At first, it seemed like each elder had this power. However, what they needed was at least 1 elder to physically travel to the summoning location in order to fast summon the other 4. But here, these 2 cloaked strangers have just zapped in and appeared out of nowhere. So maybe one of them made it to Elbaf on their own and then used that to summon the other one. But if that was the case, then it would be insane to think that this isn't just an elder ability, and that it might be something that Imu grants to all of the Holy Knights. Or alternatively, given the facial identity of the Shanks man, this could be the debut use of the power that Figgle and Garling inherited as a newfound elder. And if it is different to Saint Saturn's Yukimaru Yokai, then we could just be dealing with a completely new skill set. One that isn't bound by the rules that we experienced with Saturn. That, or this is all Imu's doing and he's allowed to break the rules. But let's talk about this not Shanks. This guy blew me. away. Because this appears to be confirmation of one of the most crackpot theories in the entire One Piece fanbase, which is evil twin Shanks, which was a thought predicated on the events of chapter 907, where Shanks was suddenly shown at the Holy Land of Marijois, and Oda purposely drew him without showing any of his actual defining characteristics, aka the scar on his face or the missing arm. And in this chapter, Oda is essentially redrawn in that same panel, but on Elbaf now. And of course he did, because if you get a look at this dude from any other angle, then you probably immediately realize that this is not the Shanks. Because you'd see, or I guess rather not see, his distinctive scar and then the lack of arm. There's more to it than that though, because there was also the startlingly casual way in which the five elders reacted to this Shanks, an Emperor of the Sea being in the Holy Land, and they said to him, "Mate, this is not the Reverie. Given your standing, you should have nothing to do with politics," which is a line that does work for Shanks. As a pirate, he really shouldn't be suddenly running for mayor of Marijois or something. But the dismissiveness makes a lot of sense if this was the brother of Shanks, who really needs a name. Let's go with Figeland Frank. If Frank was, say, a holy knight, then his standing would have nothing to do with politics either. And of course, the certain pirate that Figeland Frank was asking to see the elders about is probably Figeland Shanks himself, in which case this page will go down as one of the most brilliant subversions in all of One Piece, because there has been 6.5 years worth of speculation about the certain man that Shanks was referring to, and the fact that that certain man turns out to be Shanks himself is such a slap in the balls that we've only recently been capable of seeing coming, and we're still incapable of doing anything about. Because I have covered this idea in other videos before, but man, it is trippy to see it actually happening. And even crazier than I'm kind of into it. It's crazy because usually I think that twins are a bit of a lazy plot twist. I put them in the same sort of soap opera basket as Amnesia, which One Piece doesn't have a great record with. But I have to admire the sheer greed of Eiichiro Oda to implement this, because what we now have is a situation where we both get good Shanks and evil Shanks. And I'm probably getting way ahead of myself here, but are we looking at a potential Luffy versus Frank showdown? Because one question I've had since Egghead Island ended is, how do we escalate from here? Because One Piece doesn't go backwards, only forwards. And it just seems like there weren't a lot of places left to go after fighting all 5 Elder Stars at the same time on Egghead Island. And Loki, yes, he definitely shows a lot of promise in that regard, but I do think that he still has a lot of proving to do if he is going to be our major antagonist, which this chapter also says that he might not be. We'll get to that in a bit, but the easiest escalation in the world is going to be, well, you're going up against Shanks now. Even if it's just Frank, because the fact that he has that face, that aura, and probably even the power of 2 arms, he feels immediately commanding, and I cannot wait to see Luffy's reaction to this face. But with this, we may have also locked in another core theme of Elbaf being brothers. We've already set up a brotherly conflict between Prince Harudin and Prince Loki, who appear to be fighting for opposite futures in their own ideal direction to lead the Giants of Elbaf, and we now have another set of brothers again on opposite sides of the spectrum, Figeland Shanks and Figeland Franks, one of which appears to be working for the darkness, the bad world government who want to plunge the world into even more darkness, whereas the other is actively working towards the light, the sun god Nika, the dawn of the world, Roger's legacy, all of that. And what this does open up is a new avenue for Loki's freedom, one that doesn't have to rely on Luffy being an idiot, because given that they're both brothers on the potentially darker side of the sibling spectrum, it could be quite natural for Figeland Frank to free Loki and for them to team up in whatever cockery they have planned. And this whole situation gives me a bit of a Star Wars vibe as well. The 2 figures in dark cloaks, it's all very Sith-like at the moment. And to mention the second figure, look, I'd love to say something about him and or her, but we are staying very deliberately obscured at the moment, and sadly the only Holy Knights that we've actually seen aside from Garling were all in the God Valley flashback, so this figure is probably a new face. Or not, who knows, maybe their face is obscured because they also have the face of someone we know. But it is just such an arrogant move to only send the 2 of them, which I love. Because at the moment, I don't even feel like that arrogance is unwarranted. I already have a worse vibe from these 2 than seeing all 5 elders together. Going back to Loki though, there was a potential seed of redemption planted in this chapter for him, because we have this kind of weird scene where it plays out as if Loki is on the phone talking to his long distance girlfriend or something. So Loki has a friend, that that's nice, good for him. And there's a lot of vague things mentioned, a vague event, and but the most important thing right now is that Loki's friend references him being kind, which Loki is disgusted by. And it all feels very tsundere to me, which if you're not thoroughly enweebed, is the archetype of an initially hostile personality with a warm nature buried deep beneath all that aggression. And so for Loki, for all of his talk about death and destruction and kill murdering, he may be a bit more layered and much nicer and warmer and perhaps even sun godlier than initially presented. And that would make sense because Luffy is usually a pretty good judge of character, and if he does free Loki, then he can't be that bad, right? Right? But then we do also need to deal with the whole murdering your father thing, which isn't impossible to explain. We've only heard one side of the story, so maybe King Harold was not quite as benevolent of a king as everyone believes. But either way, as much as this chapter is defined by Figgle and Frank, this little section with Loki is what has me the most intrigued. And I think that after a few introductory chapters of peace and fun and giant shenaniganry on Elbaf, One Piece is about to get serious, grab us all by the story nuts, and 2025 is going to be a year to remember. Remember all those memes about how little screen time Shanks gets? Joke's on us. Some of those rare scenes we got of him weren't even actually him. So here is a pretty crazy statistic. Even before Figgle and Frank was revealed to have taken up some of Shanks' preciously rare screen time, Longring Longland's own Foxy had spent more time on page than Shanks and infinitely more time on screen with all of the anime filler. But what this does is open up a whole lot of new questions. In fact, most things about Shanks have now been thrown into temporary turmoil, and this very much made me rethink the iconic meeting between Shanks and Whitebeard, where Whitebeard said that Shanks' face reminds him of the person who gave him his scars. And I still think it makes more sense for that person to have been Garling, who may have defeated Whitebeard during the God Valley incident, who in his younger days did look extremely similar to Shanks. But having another Shanks face floating around does increase the pool of suspects, and perhaps the person who Whitebeard was referring to was Figgle and Frank. I'm not going to rule it out at this stage, because if it were true, then it would make Frank that much more intimidating to see on Elbaf right now. But this meeting between Shanks and Whitebeard happened an awfully long time ago now. Chapter 434 to be precise, which was published in November 2006. Almost 20 years ago, so surely Oda didn't have this Shanks double in mind the entire time, right? Well, perhaps wrong, because there is one piece of very compelling evidence to suggest that he might have, and has in fact had this idea in mind since before One Piece even began, like years before. So some of you might be familiar with all of the prototype manga that Eiichiro Oda drew before One Piece was officially serialized. Most of you know about the big names, Romance Dawn, Monsters, which featured Ryuma, Wanted, etc. There's a lot of them, because Eiichiro Oda made more than 20 prototypes before One Piece was finally accepted. And one of them is called Land of the Dragon and the 10 Thieves, the protagonist of which was a very Luffy-looking character named Victor, who served as the original leader of an Order of Knights. And this is the prototype manga that was the very first mention of the name Shanks, who inherited Victor's position as the current leader of the Order of Knights. And it's implied that this Shanks is the antagonist, because there was some sort of big war that led Victor to being defeated or being ousted, leaving, whatever happened. I guess we'll never know. But either way, the very first appearance that we know of in Eiichiro Oda media featured Shanks as a knight. So I think that seeing another Shanks-like figure this deep into One Piece as a holy knight very well could have been the plan since the beginning. Hello, funny internet man. I read a thread someone made about how Shanks and his twin brother could be mirroring Hati and Skull from Norse mythology. Hati, Shanks, chases the moon, Blackbeard, and Skull, Shanks' brother, chases the sun, Luffy. And Ragnarok signifies when they are both caught. So for some more context here, Hati and Skull are the sons of Fenrir, and it's currently a very popular idea that Figgle and Garling has or will have Fenrir-related powers because of his moon symbology. I wasn't hugely on board with that idea in the past, and still not hugely on board with it now. But the potential of having these night and day suns certainly does strengthen it. But the goal of these two wolves was to devour the sun and the moon respectively, which, as our very intelligent Grand Fleet member has stated, certainly can apply to Shanks, because practically his entire entire presence in One Piece to date has been primarily focused on Blackbeard, our personification of darkness. But something else I should say is that Norse mythology is less than clear about which wolf pursues the sun and which wolf pursues the moon. As far as my admittedly basic understanding of this goes, it's mostly up to interpretation, and that could be important because of the names. Hati means the one who hates, and that feels a bit more appropriate for the seriously geared Figgle and Frank, whereas Skull means the one who mocks, and that definitely suits our more jovial drunkard Shanks. Shanks' twin's name had better be Shaw. When the two meet, we'll then have the Shawshank Redemption. Anyone else think Ange might be Morley's sister? She does have a pretty undeniably Morley vibe about her. I think it's because they both have these very oblong faces with extremely long chins. But the thing is, according to the Vivicard data book, Morley is from West Blue, not Elbaf. So Morley could originate from one of the other tribes of giants, because they do seem to have spread all over the world, as Saul is listed as being from South Blue in the data book. So I'm not sure if Ange is related to Morley, but I do like her design. It's always great to see some unconventionally shaped women in One Piece, because Echiro Oda, he goes crazy with the men all the time, but he's usually much more reserved with women. But to go right back to conventional, I do have to mention Ripley, because due to a video export error that I didn't pick up in the last video, shame on me, her art wasn't rendered, and I just wanted to show the world that we did have a Ripley made and ready to go. And furthermore, I've been informed that there is a marked increase in people wanting to take up a career in biology following the release of this chapter, which I'm sure is just a coincidence, a very large-breasted coincidence. Luffy's pose while thanking Saul reminded me of Jinbe when he met the crew again on Wano. Yes, and there's a reason for that. It's because it is exactly the same. And I didn't recognize this pose at first because in the manga it is very subtle. In chapter 976, all you get is the close-up of Jinbe's hand, but avid anime watchers immediately recognize this because there is a proper full body shot of it, and I suppose that this is my folly for not paying close enough attention to the anime during Wano. In my defense, it was a very, very long 4 years, and whilst the episodes looked great, they were just so very slow. But what's happening here is a Yakuza greeting where you reveal the palm of your right hand, which is a symbolic gesture to indicate that you have no weapon and you're introducing yourself with no intent to start a fight. So what happened here is that Luffy saw Jinbe do this on Wano and he thought that it was so cool that he wanted to whip it out, and he's been waiting for his moment ever since. And something that Dawn and Dusk pointed out on Twitter is that this is particularly adorable because Luffy doesn't quite understand what he's saying. Because Japanese has multiple writing options, which are the kanji, as well as the more simplified hiragana and katakana, with the latter two often being used instead of kanji when a character is speaking with words that they don't fully understand, which in Japanese is how Luffy is written almost all the time. He only uses very basic kanji. And Oda uses this simplified writing style because it helps portray Luffy as a simple person, and this situation is no exception. Luffy is clearly mimicking Jinbe because he's saying the exact same thing, but Jinbe said it more eloquently with kanji, whereas Luffy is just copying it without fully grasping the meaning. And furthermore, on the next page, Luffy quickly devolves and just starts speaking nonsensically. So he tried, and you know what? He ended up doing his very best Jinbe impression for Saul, which if I were Jinbe, I would take as high praise, because Luffy clearly has a very high opinion of him to default to Jinbe's way of speaking in situations deemed as of the utmost of importance. Please never say foreskinning again. Oh. Yeah, I really should have read that before I said it. Here's the thing about the clone. It's not Stella. It's the Vegapunk that left Ohara. Alright, I have one very, very important thing to say before addressing the actual comment. I see this a lot, but why do people all over the world consistently spell O'Hara with an apostrophe as if it was an Irish surname, you know? Hi, my name is Robin and I'm from O'Hara, Ireland. I've seen people doing this ever since I first started YouTube, and that was a long time ago now. But to get into the actual comment, the implication here is that the Vegapunk clone is about 22 years behind on knowledge, assuming that it was put into storage after it returned from the Emerald Isle of O'Hara. Which, come to think of it, seems like a pretty dick move. If I was the clone, I don't think I'd be hugely happy with being stuffed in a suitcase, given my sentience and desire to not be in a suitcase. Secondly, how did the head fit into that suitcase? And thirdly, mate, if the Vegapunk that visited O'Hara was a clone, then how did it have the Megamind? Because that's the trait of Vegapunk's devil fruit, the Nomi Nomi Nomi. And look, I guess it's Vegapunk, so I guess he can do literally anything with fictional science, and so he may have made a false head. But given that he can replicate Paramecia abilities, could he have cloned himself with the devil fruit powers? And at one point in time, pre-suitcase, were there two of the smartest men in the world, devil fruit and everything? And I would be interested to see an incarnation of Vegapunk who is essentially woken up 20 years into the future, and one that doesn't have the experience of everything that's happened, with one of those key events being the transformation of Bartholomew Kuma, considering just how strongly that affected and changed Vegapunk. He might even have a different view of the future of the world. And I do like that idea a lot more than just reviving Stella, although I do maintain that it's still an emotional cop-out. Vegapunk had such a good quote-unquote death, and as I've said in the past, I don't think I'd mind this as much if it wasn't just the latest in a very, very long line of Oda finding ways to undo his own writing. Even if this situation makes perfect sense, and even if it presents a potentially interesting idea to explore, I just feel a bit tired of being death trolled. It's not about logic. There are people in the comments who are like, oh, you just can't read. It's not about that. Every survival of a death scene can be given a logical explanation, but it's about the feeling. It's about Oda writing a death scene with the purpose to milk your emotional teats, and to then sell you back the milk that you've produced. And especially because this Vegapunk clone happens at the same time that we find out everything's probably gonna be okay with Kuma, and Saul is right there in our faces as well. And Saul is a case that I do like, but having all three of them together in this one place is almost like Oda gloating, and I'm surprised he didn't find a way to dangle Pell in front of us as well. So why did Pedro have to die if nobody else does? I don't know. I was gonna say maybe it's because he was a Jaguar, but then again, so was Jaguar D Sol, so that is clearly not it. Add another mysterious, unexplained power to the list with the whole gigantifying books in the Library of the Owl. So this library was such a cool part of the chapter, something that I completely skipped over because Shanks was taking up too much space in my mental inventory. He was a burden. And this does answer a question that we've had ever since learning that Saul took the books from Ohara, which is how would he or any of the giants even read them? And I feel like I'm not the only one out there getting very strong Avatar vibes with the Owl Library. It's very Wan Shi Tong. And that's because in many cultures worldwide, the owl is considered to be a symbol of wisdom. So I suppose the Owl Library is our new tree of knowledge. My thinking with the books, though, is the same as my thinking with pretty much everything else, which is that it's another weird devil fruit power. It's gotta be devil fruit related. Perhaps the caretaker owl has eaten a fruit that allows it to grow and shrink objects. Although I don't know enough about owls to know if there's a mythological connection here, but what I do know is that there is a character named Owl in Hunter x Hunter who has a similar ability called the Fun Cloth, which shrinks anything wrapped up in it. So it could be a coincidence that there are two owls across these manga series with similar powers, or there could be a common owl origin to do with growing and shrinking things that I'm unaware of. I love how you say Kuma with your accent. Sounds like Kuma, and it makes my rotted brain giggle. Yeah, that's Australian for you. I'm actually one of the better ones. If you go too far inland, then you'll start getting the real Aussie twang, where they all say Bartholomew Kuma. And fun fact, there's actually a town called Kuma in both New South Wales and Victoria, the latter of which has a population of approximately 94 people. And I'm sure that they all refer to themselves as Kumas. What I don't understand is why can't it be Shanks himself? What confirms that this is a different person if we can't see the other side of the face? That is a very good question. And the answer is something fictional pirate, something happily ever after. I think that if this was a different manga series, then this figure actually being Shanks would definitely not be off the table, because it is a very dramatic twist to have the good mentor turn out to be the big evil man guy all along, but we do need to remember that this is One Piece. And not just that this is One Piece, more importantly that this is Eiichiro Oda. And the main reason why he draws One Piece is to have a fun, wonderful adventure. Yes, he's capable of writing gut-wrenching, hard-hitting drama covering very serious and morbid topics, but these are exceptions that are sprinkled in among the action, comedy, and adventure, because that's the priority for Oda. And he actually said this once more very recently in an interview with Iñaki Godoy, the live-action Luffy. Iñaki asked Oda what inspired him to create Luffy, and Oda said that it's because he wanted to make a protagonist who could be the ideal child. Someone who never has to grow up and follow the traditional path of adulthood. Someone who always maintains that sense of freedom that only children have. And I promise that I'm getting to the point, but we're going to get there via a bit of a Jewelry Bonnie detour. I also said in the last video that I think Oda will revive Kuma because it would be too painful for him to draw the impact that losing her father would have on Bonnie, because Oda's been writing this thread from his own life experience with his own daughters. But that applies to Luffy as well. He writes Luffy with his own ideals of childlike freedom. And to Luffy, having Shanks turn out to be evil would be an even worse outcome than Shanks dying, because the seed that planted his entire journey would turn out to be a lie. And yes, that is an interesting idea. I think other series can and have explored that, and it leads to a bit of an internal crisis as the protagonist has to reassess and find their own way in the world and blah 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 stuff. We're not talking about other series though. We're talking about One Piece, and the point is that having a twist like that would risk corrupting the ideal child that Oda wanted to create. And I don't mean that Luffy himself would become corrupted, he'd become all edgy and such, definitely not, but it risks damaging the core idea that Oda wants to make. Luffy is no longer the ideal child if the person he looks up to the most turns out to be evil and was lying to him the entire time, as if this was all part of some grand master plan. And that's the difference between something like evil Shanks and, say, Ace dying. Ace dying was tragic. I would even go so far as to say not ideal for Luffy, but Luffy is still able to carry the memory and legacy of Ace. The idea of Luffy isn't damaged by Ace's death. It is a challenge to be overcome, but everything Ace was will always be in Luffy's heart and mind. But if Shanks turned out to be evil, then it would remove him from the aforementioned heart and mind. So look, no, it's not confirmed that this isn't Shanks, but I always favor going with the more simple solution until proven otherwise. And in this case, given the nature and tendencies of Oda, the simpler solution is that yes, this is a separate bad Shanks. And look, it's very rare that Occam's razor points us towards the existence of evil twin, but this is one of those situations. However, I will say that jumping to the idea of this being Shanks' brother can and should be seriously questioned, because we do know at the very least that cloning is very possible in the One Piece world, so there are definitely other options that doesn't involve this being Shanks' twin. As a Patrick Star dressed up as Shanks in my comments ominously pointed out, just wait for the revelation that Shanks is actually an acronym for a Mads cloning project. Although just on that, let's say the cloning exists and it happens to you. In that case, what relation are you to you? That's a question that we haven't yet had to tackle as a society. But is a clone considered your sibling because it has the same mixture of DNA from your parents? Or is a clone considered your progeny because it came from you? But also, more ideas. What if Shanks and Frank are clones, but they're clones of Figeland Garling? Perhaps this was a world government project under Saint Saturn that was happening in tandem with the Mads cloning efforts to recreate their greatest moon warrior. And in which case, what we would have is 3 Shankses running around, because I would refuse to refer to them as 3 Garlings, even if it did turn out to be true. But either way, Eiichiro Oda, you have a lot of explaining to do, and I have no choice but to sit here and wait very patiently for the Story Lord to invoke more of his fictional pirate sorcery. Big things are happening in One Piece, and as always, we're going to talk about them because this is where we do that. But before we start, did you notice the secret power that our mysterious cloaked lady used on that poor giant? Or were you too focused on Ripley and thinking about the logistics of how human can make a giant pregnant? So I want to start by saying that this is an extremely strange week to be a One Piece fan, because for the first time in, I think, ever, the official translation came out before the scans did. Because due to what is almost certainly an error, or more appropriately, en erreur, the official French translation for chapter 1135 went live on Manga Plus, and at the time of recording this video, it is still live, because I imagine that everyone who could and should be fixing this is on some sort of post-Christmas, pre-New Year holiday. And this is pretty bad. I mean, One Piece does get leaked every week, but it usually doesn't get leaked by the official source. And because it's official, I don't even know if you can call it a leak. It's just an early official release, so if you can read French, then to go for it. Or if you just want to look at the pretty pictures and pretend to be cultured, then that's fine as well. Because I will say that the official French pages are much higher quality than the official English, which is a gripe that I've had for quite some time now. In fact, almost every other translation has better image quality than the English does, and I really wish that Viz would fix this, because sometimes reading the official English translation genuinely hurts my eyes because it's so blurry. That aside, we've got an amazing chapter to cover en français apparemment, donc allons-y. So very quickly on the cover story, I love what's happening here because it shows us the evolution of Tama on her quest to become a bewitching kunoichi. Tama has of course been training with Shinobu, and she's picked up enough skills to pay the bills that are hitting Hold'em in his face. Which is a great contrast because Hold'em is the guy who Tama was completely powerless against way back in Act 1 of Wano. And it's really as simple as that. We've now come full circle with Tama, and I didn't expect her to be the most interesting part of the Yamato cover story, but here we are. Moving on with Elbaf though, we spend some more time in the Owl Library, which I really appreciate because it gives us another moment of calm with Robin and Saul. It's also always nice to see Robin and Chopper bonding because they do have a shared interest in academia. Different sectors, but they're library buddies, and I find that very cute. And I'm very much savoring scenes like this because I know that very shortly we're going to be kicking into gear with all the main conflict and the dramas and actions of Elbaf, and the fun laid-back moments like this are going to evaporate for the next year and a bit at least. You don't truly realize how much you miss this stuff until you are thrust into non-stop action. But the owl, as predicted, is the one responsible for the book's growing and shrinking, and it is indeed a devil fruit, or at least it is highly suspected to be a devil fruit, because this is where having Vegapunk is paying off in a way that I did not predict, as Lilith is essentially a walking devil fruit encyclopedia, the Straw Hat's own personal Pokedex for devil fruits. Whenever they encounter a new power, they just need to whip out their Lilith, and she should be able to identify it so long as it was logged in the encyclopedia. And when they aren't logged, it's usually pretty obvious what the power is anyway, like Kaku's giraffe fruit. But Lilith deduces that this very, very old owl is probably using the Iku Ikunomi. And I'm using the Japanese name because I do think that we need the English to clear up the translation. At the moment, it's being referred to as the rear fruit. Rear as in caring for your young until they're capable of caring for themselves. But also rear just sounds like arse fruit. And I don't know if we want that. I mean, some people want that. Although I should say that Iku Iku is getting some silent chuckles within the Japanese speaking readership, because Iku most commonly means to go, it's a verb. However, in Japanese, it's also used colloquially to mean to come. And it's used that way in exactly the way you're thinking, so what we have here is the cum fruit. And we'll get back to that in a bit. That's surprisingly appropriate, because this owl's powers are the only way that I can realistically currently explain the existence of a certain child. But speaking of children, Luffy's main act in this chapter is to terrorize the children of Elbaf, which is a lot funnier than it should be. And there's a nice moment of Nami beating up both Luffy and Usopp, the latter of which got caught up in some collateral damage. And I always love seeing Nami interact with children because it brings out a lot of her personality that we don't usually get to see very often when she's just standing off in the background. Nami has two hard counters in this world. One is strong marine women because they remind her of Belmare, and the other is kids because she doesn't want any of them to go through even a modicum of the hardship that she had to suffer through as a child. Although I personally have no sympathy for these children, no sympathy at all, because all of this was but a clever ruse. Oda has decided to reuse the Momonosuke gag of acting scared in order to attain a face full of boob, which makes Sanji jealous, and I'm not sure why, because he got a ride in Gerd's chest as well, so this is just Oda being Oda. And I guess it's also finally time to talk about the artistic objectives of Elbaf. As many of you know, because I've said this many times, Oda publicly stated that he gave himself a challenge on Egghead Island to learn how to draw, quote, erotic butts. And I think on Elbaf, he's now taking every opportunity to explore a concept that I believe is known as macrophilia, a fantasy involving giants or other assorted big things. So as part of this giant exploration, we have a pretty huge revelation in this chapter, being the father of Colin, who is a human who has somehow achieved a physical coupling with Colin's mother Ripley, which does sound like quite the logistical achievement. And to now step back into the owl library, I'm just saying that this owl has the power to make things at giant size, so there is a logical explanation for this out there. Owls are, of course, not your typical intimate aid, but on Elbaf, whatever works. And notice how Oda chose to have Sanji ask the question about Colin's dad being human, because you can practically see the gears spinning in his twirly head about his own potential future with a giant. However, now that this information is out there, the internet has begun an intense investigation into who could possibly be Colin's father, and right now there's a lot of accusations involving the red hair pirates, and even finger pointing at Mr. Shanks himself, who has been an absolute menace of fostering the next generation with Luffy and Uta. However, the list of daddy candidates is surprisingly short, because before leaving the bar, the owner, Yamato, gave Colin some food for his mother Ripley and also, quote, Daddy's favorite too, implying that Colin's father is currently on Elbaf. And at the moment, there's really only one other human of relevance on Elbaf, which is the silhouetted figure who we saw talking to Crocus long time ago. The one who looks like Golden Lion Shiki, but is also highly suspected to maybe be Scopogamon. Really, his exact identity doesn't hugely matter for the sake of this discussion, but it is extremely likely that this man is Colin's father. And in this chapter, Colin does confirm confirm that his father used to be a pirate and a pretty big shot pirate as well. One who wasn't afraid of the giants of Elbaf at all. And in fact, evidently he was the exact opposite of afraid. And Ripley does say that her husband, but not husband, is much younger than she is, but that really doesn't help us narrow down the age range, because even the oldest of humans are still probably much younger than Ripley, as she does appear to wear a top that has the Jolly Roger of the giant warrior pirates on it, which has me thinking that she might be closer to the age of Dory and Broggy, both of whom are currently 160, although it's very difficult to tell with giants. Ripley could also be part of Harridan's generation, which I believe would be the last group of actually trained warriors, and Harridan's only 81, so Ripley could be around there as well, which I do point out because if the silhouetted figure is Scopper Gaban, then he would be in his late 70s now, which isn't all that much younger than Ripley would be at all. So this very patient Wano-hatted man could be a much younger character than any of us have been thinking. I should say that there are other humans on Elbaf. Loki's cloaked figures in the underworld, for example, who are probably former pirates, but I highly doubt that any of them have the sheer aura required to even register on the Ripley scale. It is surprising that Colin is only a half giant though, because he does look big enough to be a full giant, at least a full giant child. And the only other time that I can recall encountering a confirmed half giant was Big Pan during Long Ring Longland, who was actually a Wotan, a half giant, half fishman. But even then, he was definitely smaller than the average giant due to that mix. So when Colin grows up, he's probably going to be around Big Mom or Kaido size, and he's probably going to be an absolute monster in terms of strength. And I think that this plays nicely into the cover story where we see Tama starting to grow in power, because remember, all of the children that we see in One Piece aren't just there for the sake of having something to fight for and protect. All of these kids are the next generation. They are the rookies who are going to grow up and see characters like Luffy, Law, and Kid as their version of Roger, Whitebeard, and Garp. And Colin is genuinely interesting because his setup is the reverse of most stories like this, where you have the more gentle, cerebral child growing up in a tribe of warriors. Instead, what we have is Colin, a warrior growing up in a gentle tribe, and he is an outcast because of it. The next generation of giants all see him as some sort of uncouth savage, and in fact, come to think of it, they probably equate his behavior to what they know of Loki, who, whether he did these things or not, is currently being labeled as an evil, violent savage. So my prediction with Colin is that at some point he's going to save the day. Something bad's gonna happen with these kids, and all the other kids are gonna be too scared to do anything. But Colin is going to act in the traditional way of an Elbaf warrior and save the day, or at least he's gonna try to. And something I'd love to see more of is how this cultural development is affecting Usopp. This is the land of his dreams, and it's turned out to be not really what he expected. Although at the moment he's taking this in quite well and adapting to this surprisingly friendly environment, but at some point he's got to realize that there's a bit of a disconnect here with his dream. Although I think this actually opens up a pretty brilliant opportunity for Usopp, because Usopp, of all people, actually embodies more of the traditional values of Elbaf than the current generation. So when things do get bad, it may very well be up to Usopp to protect the giants, or at least the giant children, because even though he is the least physically equipped, he may end up being the most mentally equipped. That's my hope anyway. If we leave Elbaf and Usopp doesn't get a key moment like that, then look, I'm just going to give up on Straw Hat development going forward. But for now, I have hope. Now, as fun as all of this is, we've got some seriously not fun stuff happening around the Western Village, as we have 2 more pages of the cloaked intruders from the last chapter, and to continue the sense of mystery, Oda elects not to actually show us the Shanks lookalike at all in this chapter. At least nothing to do with his face, because I think that Oda is going to be very reserved with him until the time actually comes to reveal who he is, because this dude, he's pretty tricky to handle. There's only so many different angles that you can draw him in without giving away that it's not Shanks, or alternatively without giving away that it is Shanks, whichever side of that you land on. However, there is a little piece of intrigue about him here, because even in miniature silhouette, we can make out a sword that resembles not only Shanks' griffin, but also Figeland Garling's unnamed blade. So whatever this brand of sword is, appears to be a traditional Figeland weapon. I've seen some people say that this might be the uniform sword style of the Holy Knights, but apart from Garling and Figeland Frank, we haven't seen any other Holy Knight actually use a sword. Even in Dragon's silhouette mind image of the Holy Knight, Oda only shows one figure with a sword, which is almost certainly Frank, because he doesn't have Garling's very distinct hair. And so at first, mate, this makes perfect sense, that Shanks would carry the same kind of sword as his father and alleged twin, but also it makes not a lot of sense, because all the way from babyhood, Shanks was raised by the Roger Pirates, which means that at some point during his career, Shanks must have confronted his family and either stolen the sword or was potentially even given Griffin for whatever reason. Perhaps that reason was something family honor. I don't know, that'll do for now. Because the main point of interest in this chapter is the mysterious, assumedly, woman. And what she does right here is a bit difficult to pass. I'm not sure if what happened here was depicted as well as it could have been, or if this is just Oda keeping her power vague on purpose. But it looks like our cloaked lady has an ability that involves conjuring and or manipulating bandages, because they suddenly appear wrapped around the giant and they seem to constrict him into submission. And what this reminds me of is Black Maria, because in her Vivia card entry, it was revealed that Oda wasn't originally going to make her a Spiderzoa. She was actually going to be a Paramecia user, and her devil fruit was the Obi Obi no Mi, which means sash fruit, and it would have allowed her to create and manipulate hyper durable sashes from anywhere on her body, which I thought was a very cool idea and kind of wanted to see in action more so than the Spiderzoan, and that might be what we're seeing here. This could be Oda repurposing that devil fruit idea, which has happened in the past, and if so, I think this would be a bit of a landmark moment in One Piece, as it would give us our first non-Emu World Noble devil fruit user, assuming that the 5 elders aren't individual fruit users and that their powers are an extension of Emu's abilities. Because I imagine that eating devil fruits is quite a taboo act in World Noble society, because they believe themselves to be their gods and their enemies to be demons and devils. So eating a devil fruit is very much feasting on the evil, cursed, forbidden fruit. And that could be what separates the Holy Knights from the rest of the World Nobles. They could be a force who have taken evil upon themselves in order to use it to protect the good. It may be mandatory for Holy Knights to become devil fruit users to consume powers so that they cannot be used against them. And that may also be why they don't use the same sort of diving gear as all the other World Nobles do, because they're already fallen beings. They have consumed the sinister fruits and have no need to protect their already very exposed lungs from the evil air of the masses. But either way, these two are looking for Loki, which is curious because the initial thought is that they went to Elbaf to pursue Luffy, or at least that was my thought. So is it possible that Figland, Frank, and Friend of Frank are here for a completely unrelated purpose? Because we have another talk from the giant guards about how Loki is a bad criminal man who killed our beloved King Harold, and every time someone repeats this, it makes me more inclined to think that it isn't true, and that what's happened here with Loki has been more of a tragic misunderstanding, an act that Loki is putting on for the good of Elbaf, and that this King Harold was not quite as benevolent of a man as everyone claims. So I'm very keen to see how this all plays out, because if these Holy Knights want to see Loki, then I'm not sure that there is anything on this island capable of stopping them. Colin's dad is 150% Copacabana. Used to be a pirate, come on. He's basically telling us at this point. So the funny thing is that just knowing he was a pirate doesn't narrow down the list of candidates at all, because all of the major theories already assume that this guy was a pirate. And something very interesting about Colin is that, like all the giants, it's very difficult to tell how old he is. Due to the slow aging of giants, he could even be older than most of the Straw Hats, which would make sense with some sort of Copacabana-based timeline, because after the Roger Pirates split up, that was when Ace was conceived, and much later than it should have been, eventually born. And in Big Mom's flashback, we see a tiny, perhaps Colin-sized Harudin, and he's currently 18 years old at this point, although I would argue that Colin currently resembles the more pudgy baby Harudin that Oda adorably drew that one time. Whoever the father is, though, he deserves more credit than most, I think, because this is a rare occasion in One Piece where it appears that the father hasn't outright abandoned the child. And actually, you know what? Ripley, she deserves credit as well, because this is a rare case in One Piece where the mother hasn't tragically died. So you know what? We've got an uncharacteristic good little family thing happening here. Crack theory, though, I've mentioned this before, but the one thing that stops me going all in on Copacabana is Ripley's age. She said that she was from the last generation of trained Elbaf warriors, which likely refers to Harudin's generation. So Ripley would be around 80, whereas Copacabana would be in his late 70s by now, if that is indeed the generation in question. It may not be, but if it is, then Copacabana is not much younger than Ripley. So what if we start looking at the generation after? Enter Mad Lad Rouge, a man who enjoys a challenge and his hobby is canonically lovemaking. The dude likes to get around, and it would be a wild way to get our final Worst Generation member into the story before we head off into Laugh's Tale and do all of the final war stuff. To be clear, I don't think this is the case at this stage, but it would be pretty funny if it was. Seems parking your bicycle in an airplane hangar is more effective than you thought, Internet Man? Look, I never said that the bicycle wouldn't get parked. I just thought that the airplane hangar was excessive. There's a saying in my language, with some will and a little bit of skill, even an elephant can screw a chicken. You have a beautiful language. I would have been shocked by Ripley and her husband's mechanics if Big Mom's family didn't exist. So here's something that we should clarify, because this is scale in One Piece. It's difficult to get your head around. Mostly because Oda consistently changes it depending on what art looks cooler. But Big Mom is a lot less big than her name would imply, and a lot more mother than you would initially think. But she often looks the size of a giant, but in fictional reality she's only 8.8 meters tall, whereas Harden, for example, is 22 meters tall. So there is still a pretty colossal difference between them. And Kaido, mate, he's even smaller than Big Mom. He's just over 7 meters tall. So compared to Charlotte Lin Lin, Kaido would be defined as a short king, or perhaps a short emperor. Although I should also point out that Big Mom did conceive a child with a tontata, so that resets the scale and completely invalidates my argument. Harold committed word I can't say on YouTube, and Loki is protecting his father's giant pride, which died in a non-warrior way. It's definitely another avenue. Whatever happens from here, I do think that there is going to be a tragic twist in regards to blaming Loki for Harold's death, and it could be something along those lines. Loki sacrificing his freedom and his honors to make sure that his father was given a warrior's death, at least as far as the other residents of Elbaf are concerned anyway. And I would say that word I can't say on YouTube is too dark for One Piece, but we've recently seen a panel of Child Robin considering just that. And I was wrong about Ginny when I said that it would be too dark for One Piece to have her forced into intimate scenarios. Although neither of those situations were explicitly mentioned or shown, they were obviously and heavily implied. But at the moment, I'm still on board with the Harold wasn't as good of a guy as everyone thinks, and Loki is putting on an act to protect Elbaf, but it could definitely go in a bunch of other directions as well. Another popular TV series had a character labeled Kingslayer, bad action done for a noble reason. That's true, and that other TV series would be Game of Thrones, referring to Jaime Lannister, a guy initially portrayed as an unambiguous villain, in somewhat the same way that Loki is currently being treated. And in this chapter, I don't know if the term Kingslayer will officially be used, but it's the same idea, and I do think that we're setting up for a similar reveal. And the Game of Thrones comparison doesn't come out of nowhere, because Eiichiro Oda is allegedly quite a big Game of Thrones fan. Although I should say that there is no official statement from Oda directly. This comes from Craig Werner, who works with Shueisha, and as an advisor on the live-action series, who has met Oda many times, and was apparently the one to introduce him to Game of Thrones. Well, a long story less long, the Loki Kingslaying plot could be inspired by that, or it could be inspired by not that, or it could not exist at all. One of those options will be correct. The knights teleporting directly into the throne room, right at the foot of the throne, is still the sketchiest thing going on. So to add to the idea of King Harold maybe not being such an amazing guy, it is interesting that the Holy Knights had a fast travel point to a throne room in Elbaf. Now, we still don't know exactly how this ability works, but if an Elder Star in the past were to have visited Elbaf to conduct some nefarious plottings with King Harold, then it may have been a good idea to mark the throne room with a method of transportation for quick and easy communication. Or we could go even further back. Let's say that during the Void Century, Emu was on Elbaf for whatever reason and decided to leave a fast travel waypoint there just in case. Because the alternative to that sort of restriction would be that the world government can essentially travel anywhere they want at any time. In which case, we are not safe anywhere. But as for why the knights are here, one thought I had is that they could have been sent to retrieve Loki's Devil Fruit, aka kill him in order to take the power, and they've been sent here now because the world government are fully aware that Luffy has awakened his innate sun god abilities, and they need something to combat those powers. And so Loki's legendary Devil Fruit, combined with his own outrageous claims of being the sun god, could do just that. The only way to combat a god is with your own god. You gotta fight fruit with fruit. It is a fruit fight. Both giants didn't recognize the cloaked man, so he's definitely not Shanks. I actually see that differently. I see that as evidence that they haven't properly seen his face. Because my thinking is that once they do see his face, they'll immediately go, yo, Shanks, mate, didn't expect to see you back here so soon. And then it would take a while to realize, wait a minute, he has 2 arms and I, miscellaneous giant, am pretty sure that Shanks only had 1 of those. But then while this thought process is happening, Figgle and Frank has already sliced him to pieces. Something like that. I need you to ask your artist to redraw Robin with her Elbaf outfit with her bangs. If you can't pay them, I'll do it for you. That's a very generous offer, but it's already been done. But what I will say is that if you would like to contribute, then you can become a channel member. All of those funds, as well as any sponsorships we take, go directly to paying the artists and editors of Grand Line Review, because they're expensive as crap, and rightfully so, because they do amazing work. I really like how Colin is essentially a reversal of Vicky the Viking. Yes, that's very important to linger on. Vicky the Viking was a major inspiration for One Piece, and Colin's design is based on the titular Vicky. However, Vicky in the show is the exact opposite of him. Vicky was a very polite and violence-averse boy who grew up in a rowdy, violent-centric Viking village. Vicky wasn't strong at all, but he was smart, real smart. And it was often Vicky's intelligence in combination with the strength of his fellow Vikings that got everyone out of rough situations. And our Colin is the opposite. He's a natural-born warrior, growing up in a tribe of polite enlightenment, which I will refer to from here on out as politenment. And I'm fascinated by this, because usually the message in this sort of thing would be that violence isn't always the answer. But it looks like Colin's arc is putting us on the path of, no wait, sometimes violence is the acceptable answer and we should do it. Anyone else notice the only girl amongst the giant children? The one that calls Colin a brute? That's a very good eye. There is indeed a horned woman in this chapter. And this is very easy to miss because a lot of Elbaf residents wear helmets with Viking horns. But this woman here just naturally has horns popping out of her head, which is the same trait that we saw a lot on Wano with characters like Kaido, Yamato, Black Maria, Ulti, and Page 1. And this woman isn't even the only one. One of the children being terrorized by Luffy on the swing also has natural horns, as does a young girl yelling in the crowd. And if you look closely enough, you'll probably be able to find even more. So there's definitely some diversity happening on Elbaf. And this could be the arc where we find out how the Oni came to be. Or these children could be descendants of ancient giants who are also horn-clad, or perhaps even the Oni themselves were descendants of the ancient giants. Whatever it turns out to be, the seeds are all here, out in the open. There's a ton of characters with natural horns in your face, and at some point, we're going to find out why. Hold'em was a headliner, the same level as Hawkins and Apu. The guy fought Ashura Doji as well. You're telling me a kid as weak as Otama defeated someone like him? It's laughable, but to make it make sense at least a little, Lamau. Alright, so a couple of things. The first and most important is that Tama hasn't defeated Hold'em. She's just kicked him in the face. Secondly, Hawkins was a headliner, but to the best of my knowledge, Scratchman Apu was not. When he was reintroduced, he was called the Beast Pirates Informant, so he was kind of like their very flamboyant one-man cypherpole unit. And thirdly, aside from Hawkins, the headliners all kind of sucked. You know who else is a headliner? Fortrix, the man whose face was the butt of a chicken. And if you look at the full list of headliners, there isn't a single notable presence among them in terms of actual strength. They're mostly jokes like Hamlet or Briscola, or background utility characters like Bao Huang. So I don't see it as weird that Tama got the better of Hold'em. And if anything, it's more of an indictment of Basil Hawkins that he was only able to rise to the level of headliner, whilst Giga Chads like Diaz Drake went on to become a Toby Roper. Internet man, you seem to have forgotten we finally got the new outfits for the remaining Straw Hats. Sometimes I do forget things, but other times I'm strategically not mentioning them. And in this case, I waited to talk about the new outfits because I think I'd be doing this channel a disservice if I did so without our art. But our crew art is ready now. In fact, our full crew are now finally dressed to impress. And my favorite of these 4 new outfits is definitely Jinbe. Because a man of his width really suits the giant aesthetic. Because he has the size to pull it off. I love the fur cloak and the massive belt with the dragon or the Sea King or whatever it is on it. And I think he's carrying a mighty axe on his back, which I would love to see him actually use at some point. Because the idea of Jinbe combining Fishman Karate with any kind of weapon just seems appealing to me. But the next most notable outfit is probably Robin, and it's notable because it's actually quite conservative by her standards, and this makes sense because this set of Straw Hat outfits were made by Gerd, whereas the first 6 were made by Road. So you can really see the difference in priorities between the two giants when you compare Nami and Robin especially. But in general, what Gerd has done, she's focused on accuracy. She's given the crew mini Elbaf outfits, whereas Road has focused on fantasy. His outfits are designed for his heightened fabricated world, where the men look as cool as possible and the women look as physically appealing as possible. But with that said, Frankie and Brooke are, they're pretty alright. I'm not hugely over the moon with either of them. With Frankie, I think it's because I already miss his cowboy look. And Brooke seems like he's just been given a very standard outfit, whereas I feel like him being a skeleton usually gives Oda license to be much more creative with him. I do really like Frankie's beard though. And you know what? I think we need more beards for the crew as a whole. because Usopp and Frankie look so good with them. And as for the crew, something that we should also point out is that they have now split up again, which generally indicates that stuff is about to go down. The Straw Hats very rarely encounter proper danger with all 10 of them together, because when they're all together, there's really almost nothing that could possibly threaten them. But Robin and Chopper are now in their group. Frankie's gone off looking in trees or something, and the rest of the crew have gone off to party, which will probably fracture further from there, and we'll get into the standard crew pod chaos. The owl can't modify the size of living beings. It is specified in the chapter. Alright, so I want to be clear that in the last video, when I implied that a centuries-old owl used its magical fruit powers on a penis, that was a joke. However, it has brought up a rather interesting translation issue that I didn't notice. We won't have the official English translation to clear this up for a while because that's how One Piece works with the New Year break. The chapter leaks very, very early. However, thanks to the official French translation being mistakenly uploaded to Manga Plus, which is still up by the way, they haven't fixed it yet. But thanks to that, we do have an official source of this owl text, and it says the following: Il peut rendre énorme tout ce qui est inorganique, which is very poor pronunciation, but it is very clear wording. It says that the owl can only make inorganic things grow. However, this is very, very different to what we currently have in English, where what we see is Lilith saying to think even inorganic things can grow with this power, which is potentially very poor wording because it implies that the fruit definitely obviously affects organic things. And it's actually surprising that it can also be used on inorganic things as well. To think that even inorganic things, I was thinking that it was just organic. For now, I would definitely believe the official French. However, I will say that I'm personally hoping that the scans are correct, because if so, could be setting up a future where this owl uses its abilities to do something very, very cool, like say briefly turn the Straw Hats into giants to do battle on Elbaf. But even if it is just objects, the ancient owl doesn't feel like just set dressing to me. Yes, it could just exist to explain how giants can read books, but it could also be a setup for a potential plot point down the line to make something real big. Because we've got to remember that this is not just some random owl. This owl is so old that none of the giants seem to know exactly how old it is, which is crazy because giants already live for hundreds of years. So right now we could be seeing a creature that lived during the Void Century for all we know. And hey, this owl-based conspiracy could run even deeper than we know. Depending on which translation is correct, this could be big stuff, because we could even begin thinking of wild ideas such as, do giants even exist? Or has the entire race of giants just been subject to the abilities of this owl? Did this owl make a whole ton of people real big a long time ago, and did that go on to become the giant race? Again, this sort of thinking is not currently supported in French, but lack of French support has never stopped English speakers from doing stupid things before. In fact, I think it only encourages us. And if there's anything that Elbaf has taught me in its short time so far, it's that apparently anything and everything is possible, as One Piece is now more of a fantasy series than it's ever been before. Although there's still something about Elbaf that lingers uncomfortably with me, which is that as great as everything is, we are on the verge of very much ignoring that warning about not overstaying our welcome on this island. And I don't think we're gonna have to wait too long to find out what those consequences are. We have new information about the fabled sun god Nika, who is perhaps not quite the liberator that was previously advertised, with Elbafian mythology stating that the world has already been destroyed 2 times over as 2 holy knights attempt to make a third, and Luffy is now within mere moments of meeting Figgle and Frank. And rather uncharacteristically, there's also a pretty big development in our Yamato cover story here as well. This chapter has it all, and it looks like we're finally going to find out who is behind all of these kidnappings, and I wonder who it could be. I actually love this little building that obviously belongs to Who's Who. It's like a mini Onigashima because Who's Who has very similarly shaped horns. And I guess this is the reason why Minatomo was kidnapped, because he was the carpenter who designed and built Kaido's mansion on Onigashima. So I believe that Who's Who has kidnapped him to design and construct his pussy fortress. So what we have here is the poor man's Onigashima, and I for one am thrilled to see it, because one of my biggest lingering Wano questions is what happened to the Tobiropo? They were in a very difficult spot because they had no way of leaving Wano, but if they were to stay, then they're eventually going to be found by one of the vassals, or in this case Yamato, any of whom are capable of downing them. So it's a very bold maneuver to advertise yourself this way, but what this is giving me a lot of hope for is that we'll see the other Tobiropo members, and maybe even make some allies out of some of them, like say Ulti on page 1. But having a sign of Husu on the cover is pretty ridiculously good timing considering the content of this chapter, because Husu was of course the very first person who introduced us to the concept of Nika. It was during his racist tirade against Jinbe that gave us the original iconic Nika silhouette that has been expanded upon in this very chapter, and I have to say that we are starting out 2025 very strong, as we have already cleared one bingo square, because we have Sun God lore, which is also what we're going to call Trafalgar lore when he reaches his Gear 5th form, as is the destiny of all characters apparently. But the idea of Nika has simultaneously become a lot more clearer and a lot more obscured after this chapter, which is pretty perfectly represented by the new image we have of him. It has this wonderful storybook vibe, and there's a lot more detail than in the original silhouette, but it still loses very little of its initial mystery. The one thing that and I think that most of you will have noticed straight away is the shield, because this shield has the exact same symbol on it as we saw in Bartholomew Kuma's church on the Sorbet Kingdom, which is also the shape of the sapphire necklace that Kuma gave Bonnie for her 10th birthday. And furthermore, this symbol is also present within the crest of the Kozuki clan, which often goes unnoticed because everyone's probably distracted by this funky looking bird. So it has been suspected for a while that this is some sort of symbol of the sun god, but this is the first time that we have been able to directly tie it to Nika. And within Giant Society, it is the great ambition of everyone to become the sun god, at least according to Road. And this is where things get really fascinating, because there is some pretty extreme disagreement on exactly what the role of the sun god is. First up, we have the title that we're familiar with, the Warrior of Liberation, the dude who frees the other dudes. But then there's also a belief in Loki's idea that the sun god is meant to bring about destruction. And he's also described as a god who just laughs. It's a bit Holy Trinity-esque, because these three pieces also reflect our current knowledge of the sun god, which is a being fractured in three parts, being Nika, Joy Boy, and Luffy. At least those three anyway, because who knows how many others have inherited this mantle over time. And the most likely outcome is that all three of these aspects are true to some degree. That the sun god will liberate, the sun god will also destroy, and mate, you better believe he's gonna laugh. And I feel like you can take these three aspects and apply them to Luffy during any single arc. For example, during Whole Cake Island, Luffy liberated Sanji, he destroyed Whole Cake Chateau, and he laughed a whole lot whilst doing it. Again, this is a triple threat that you can see him pull off in pretty much any arc, but I've been feeling a bit nostalgic for Whole Cake Island in particular lately. Back to liberation, destruction, and laughter, Luffy's already on track for a big endgame destruction actually, given Madame Charlie's Fishman Island prophecy, but that destruction will most likely be a good thing if it does happen. As I mentioned before, according to Elbafian mythology, the world has already been destroyed 2 times over. And one of those occasions I would speculate would be the transition between the Age of Heaven and the Age of the Sea Circle. And if you don't know what those are, then don't worry, I've got a video covering them coming out shortly. But TLDR, the Age of Heaven was the previous calendar system that the One Piece world used before adopting the modern day system, which was a shift that occurred somewhere around 1500 years ago. That point in time feels like a really good spot for the world to have potentially been destroyed and reborn, whatever that means. But also I should say, it's not just Luffy who demonstrates the three aspects of the sun god. It's also Loki as well. It's very tempting to view him as someone who only invests in the destruction belief. However, Loki believes quite profoundly in freedom and liberation as well. Such as the very first discussion he had with Luffy when he did the whole "no man chooses to be chained" speech. And of course he laughs all the time. At the end of this chapter, he's even laughing whilst battling the anger and sadness of the potential of his wolf friend dying. It was like he'd eaten a smile fruit. So Loki is a triple threat as well. Although my inclination at this stage is that Loki might be trying a little bit too hard to force all of these sun god qualities. His laughter doesn't seem quite as natural to me as Luffy's, and from what we hear about him in this chapter, it would appear that he's destroying things more for the sake of the destruction, unlike Luffy, whose destruction generally has a greater purpose. And sometimes even unintentional. Luffy often doesn't go out to destroy things, destruction just follows him. However, fun Loki thing, and good on you if you notice this, you're very clever. But in the brief Loki flashback, there's a panel of him laughing in the OG Gear 5th Luffy pose, which does look very natural, and so Loki is really pushing his narrative claim to this role in every way he can. And Oda is doing everything he can to enforce that, mate, this could be a sun god. But speaking of, we do get some more Loki history as told by the Giants, which, as I've said in other videos, take what these Giants are saying with some skepticism, because everything that we know about Loki has been colored by what others have said about him, and not so much what we've actually seen him say and do. And so they say that Loki attacked various villages with underworld beasts, he started fires, and he put people's lives at risk for all sorts of epic pranks. And yeah, this does sound quite bad, but what this section reminds me of is a more extreme version of Usopp's The Pirates Are Coming. When we were first introduced to this idea during Syrup Village, it was painted as if Usopp was being a menace to society. He got all the villagers worked up, and he was seen as the black sheep of Syrup Village, the annoyance, the shame, and there was even a scene where they were all coming after him and they were going to beat him up with brooms and other assorted household objects. But then at the end of the arc, Oda did his now patented heartbreaking twist, which was that this was Usopp's coping mechanism after his dad left and his mother died. And to some degree, the village did appreciate it. Even though it was annoying, very annoying, people were using it for consistency and timekeeping and such. It had become part of the village's identity. So this might be me looking too deeply into Loki, but I am getting some strong Usopp vibes from how the Giants are describing Loki's childhood, and even though they're saying that he's doing all of these objectively terrible things, that there could be a much more tragic and even innocent element to Loki at play here. Usopp isn't the only one either. The other character that Loki is starting to really remind me of is Kozuki Oden, because he had a very similar reputation on Wano, and he was an untamable beast of a child who was starting fights in gambling dens before he was double digits. He also caused a flood in the flower capital, threatened a priest, and stole so many wives that it caused a historical event known as the Harem Revolt. But the thing is, with Oden, half of these things had pretty good reasoning behind them, such as causing the flood. He did it accidentally because he couldn't stand the sight of seeing people suffer in a drought. And Loki's destruction could be similar, and everything being said to us here could still be much more innocent than it seems. And we'll only really know for sure once we see Loki's real flashback from his perspective. But also we have a mother mention. Loki's mother passed away a year after he was born, which is very much the One Piece mother curse at play yet again. However, I have to give some praise to the Queen of the Giants because she got away with having Haruden, but then, she got greedy, pumped out another child, and after Loki, the One Piece mother curse could ignore her no longer. At one point, Loki also set out to sea, which is when he was beaten by Shanks. And that's almost certainly the time period where Loki got his bounty as well, which may also fuel the idea that Loki was considered the fourth Emperor of the Sea at some point before Shanks, and that Loki's defeat is what left that seat open for Shanks to take. And all of these things may be revealed shortly because we are now seriously converging in on that there Loki, as we have Luffy, Zoro, and surprisingly Nami all making their way down to the underworld, which is great. Zoro wants to go because he's concerned about Luffy, and Nami needs to go because she can't allow Luffy and Zoro to go anywhere without her, which is very nostalgic. It's a lot like the old days of East Blue all over again, except this time Road is here, and Road is certainly getting a lot more prominence than I thought he would. And look, this is just my personal theory. I think that Oda might be a bit of a submissive in real life, because he's decided to make Road into Nami's slave, Nami's third slave, and as a man who married an actress who played Nami, I can't help but think that Oda is doing some vicarious living through these characters, although this does give us some very important Sanji related information, as after Jinbe joined the crew and got a high bounty, Luffy, Zoro, and Jinbe became the monster trio, and Sanji has now found his place in the newly formed Nami slave trio alongside Road and Zeus. So I guess let's officially start the Road for Straw Hat campaign. But unless something changes very, very soon, Luffy is about to come face to face with the face that he's looking for but possessed by the wrong person. One thing I really like about this is that at first it seems a bit odd that Zoro and Nami are even entertaining the idea of seeing Loki, especially Nami, but it's because of how much Luffy wants to meet Shanks. And he's sort of going to get that wish, I suppose, when he rocks up to Loki and sees Vigilant Franks as well as his partner whose name is Gunkko. We have her full design reveal and I feel quite mixed about it, honestly. To me, it just feels like she doesn't have the, the One Piece punch I'm looking for. Her design comes off as a bit generic for my taste, as if you could plonk her into any shonen manga and she would fit right in, which isn't a good thing. And I think a big part of this is because her outfit is very Japanese Gakuran school uniform inspired, which does give her those generic high school setting vibes, as if she's part of some elite senior group in some sort of high school battle manga, which is intentional and makes sense, by the way, because Gunkko means army child, and this style of uniform was inspired by Japanese combat uniform. But even for One Piece, I don't know, Gunkko, she just feels a bit done. The combination of the hat, the goggles, and the hairstyle also make her feel a bit like edgy fan art of Koala, as if this is a universe where Koala has been corrupted by Imu and is being forced to fight against her love man Sabo. I mean, it's fine. It's not terrible. It's not terrible at all. It's just not something I'm hugely excited about. And I would say that this goes towards the argument that Oda really struggles to design unique women, much more so than he does with men. But the only thing that stops me saying that is that the man standing next to Gunkko is a perfect facsimile of Shanks. So you know what? I guess Gunkko certainly does have a lot more going for her in terms of uniqueness than Figgle and Frank does. We also get another close-up of Frank in this chapter, and it's the same angle as always. Oda actually cannot draw him from another perspective because it'll give away whether or not he has Shanks' scar. There's also a really funny part where there's a speech bubble covering that part of his face as well. But back to Gunkko, there are 2 points of interest, one of which is quite literal. It's the arrow that she's creating with her fabric powers, because it is very reminiscent of the arrow that Imu used to attack Cobra and Sabo, which I would say is a very natural influence, except that no one but the 5 elders are supposed to know about Imu. That's been the assumption anyway, because the more people who know about the secret, the harder the secret is to keep secret. However, it may very well be the case that the Holy Knights are inducted into the presence of Imu, and perhaps even gifted with abilities like the elders are, but to a lesser extent. Hence why they may be able to travel via magic spell circle as well. More to say about that in a bit, because this chapter really does make the Holy Knights as a group much more interesting. But first, I also want to point out that Gunkko has these really kind of odd feet? I really don't know what's going on here. It looks almost robotic in nature, so maybe these are some sort of augmented limbs, or even a raid suit-esque style technology that allows her to move in crazy ways. Or maybe it's just fashion. Sometimes it's fashion. But we do now know why our knights have traveled to Elbaf, and it is to recruit Prince Loki, which is an idea that I'd never even dared to entertain, that a world noble organization would allow someone without that sacred god's blood to join their ranks. But Loki, he is a very big and very clever man. So he actually goes on to ask whether Gunkko and Franks are world nobles themselves. And they say nothing, which is pretty much as good as just saying no. And this is massive because everything would make a lot more sense if that were the case. The fact that none of the Holy Knights wear that same protective bubble attire as the rest of the world nobles, that's probably because they aren't world nobles by blood. And just think about what that could imply in the case of Mr. Figgle and Garling. Him becoming an Elder Star would be even more shocking and taboo if he had no world noble genetic heritage. To many, this could be seen as blasphemy, or at least to the remaining 4 elders, because the world nobles as a whole seem to really support and admire Garling, which makes this dynamic that much more curious. To think that they don't look down on this group of people like they do every other human. Which also brings up the question of whether or not the Figlins were even part of the 20 founding families, although my inclination would still be to say yes, and that perhaps our Holy Knights are adopted into these families and granted the status of their name. There might even be 1 knight per family for a total of 19 minus the Nefertaris and something like that. I have no idea. But I also don't think it's a coincidence that they've approached Loki with this offer to become a Holy Knight now. This is probably in response to Luffy's awakening, the miserable defeat of the other elders on Naked Island, and Imu coming into contact with Joy Boy's throbbing haki. And it feels like the sort of thing that Garling would have ordered himself. Because he's a very pragmatic man, Garling sees strength and wishes to acquire said strength, whereas the other 5 elders would probably spend weeks, months, maybe even years in their old man room sipping tea and debating about whether or not approaching Loki is a good idea before ultimately deciding that he's too much of a wild card and a threat to global stability. You know, boring old man stuff. But we can't afford to do that at the moment. This is peacetime talk, and Garling is a wartime elder. The world government are in a very precarious situation on the potential of collapse for the first time in a millennia. And so Garling doesn't have the luxury of sitting down to have tea and hypotheticals. He just needs to do the battle mats, and he needs to do it quickly. However, Loki does refuse, and then we have his wolf friend being threatened, which is quite sad because you may or may not have noticed this, but this same wolf appears earlier on in the chapter when the giants are talking about Loki's childhood pranks, which means that Loki has known this wolf since he was a child. So there is a genuine bond of friendship there. As Loki Loki probably has with all of his other underworld animals as well. And that is exactly what makes his end of chapter declaration that much more powerful. Because this is the Elbaf I expected. Loki's philosophy of warriors not losing their composure when confronted by death, and also how to channel emotions like anger and sadness. With Loki stating that he will essentially consume those feelings and use them as fuel to destroy the world. So take the stuff about destroying the world out for a second, and this would be the perfect summation of the warrior lifestyle, because you cannot walk this path while being concerned about death, no matter whose death it is, including your own. Do I think that the wolf will actually die? I don't know. I mean, choking animals, that seems a bit dark for One Piece, but also it would be a pretty damn effective way to immediately show us just how despicable the Holy Knights are. Sort of like Hirohiko Araki's principle of constructing villains in JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. For most of JoJo's run, Araki's philosophy was that the quickest and easiest way to make readers hate a character was to have them kill a dog. Same sort of thing could work here. But also I could see the wolf being saved by something as simple as Zoro slicing the fabric, because what we should remember is that this wolf isn't just Loki's friend, it's also Luffy's friend now. He bonded with those animals. And so from here, it's going to be hard to predict what's going to happen, but I do have a feeling that this could be the incident/conflict that will result in Loki being freed. I've heard it suggested that Gunkko is the attendant of Emu that we've seen in some scenes. So I've heard that suggested as well from you right now. And I gotta say, I don't mind the idea, because Emu's attendant is an even more mysterious character than Emu himself. At the moment, all we know is that her dialogue in the anime has a female voice, and I suppose it's very possible that this could be a member of the Holy Knights and maybe even Gunkko herself. It's deliberately left very vague in both the manga and the anime, but it does look like this attendant could be wearing the same cloak as our Holy Knights are. I tell you what though, recently an old rejected character design for Thriller Bark was dug up, which is this cloaked woman in bandages, which for the purposes of Thriller Bark was probably intended to be a mummy theme, but it is very reminiscent of the Gunkko we see before us today. And in fact, this rejected design looks like Emu's attendant a lot more to me than it does Gunkko, but I think that Oda has been trying to implement something like this for quite a while, and it's always ended up being cut for one reason or another. Because I brought this up before, but Oda wanted to do the same thing with Black Maria, and give her a fabric-based devil fruit before deciding to go full spider. I was thinking that the goggles may have been hinting that Gunkko is a clone of Koala. Maybe when she was a slave, Saturn harvested her DNA. So this is the danger of living in a post-Egghead world. As soon as our first clone reveal happened during that arc, I vividly remember saying that from now until the end of One Piece, clones are going to work their way into every theory. Here's the thing though, I don't mind it. I'm not sure why Koala would be targeted specifically, but I have briefly discussed the idea of both Shanks and Frank. They may be clones of Figgle and Garling, an attempt to replicate the world government's most powersome warrior, and it almost lines up. It comes so very close, but doesn't quite get there, because Mads was founded 39 years ago, which is the exact same amount of years ago that Shanks has been alive. So it was unlikely to have been Mads, who as far as we're aware are responsible for the advent of cloning. So for this to work, Saint Saturn would have needed to have his own cloning project in place, a pretty damn successful one as well. And if so, then perhaps all of the Holy Knights are clones of figures that the world government has captured or hired. But I still have no good answer as to why they would clone a koala, unless there's something genetically special about her that we're not aware of yet, or alternate option, perhaps Koala is a clone of Gunkko who was deemed a Sanji level failure and relegated to slavery as a result. And maybe not necessarily Gunkko, but Gunkko and Koala could be clones of someone else, like the potential Shanks and Frank's dynamic. I say potential, the cloning stuff is still very firmly rooted in crackpot nonsense. There's a lot to explain that I cannot explain, such as how Koala had a family on an island. But still, it's good to bring up these ideas because 1 in every 100 crackpot, weird, stupid One Piece idea turns out to be correct. The other 99 times, the answer turns out to be something very simple, like Oda just made another character with a hat and some goggles. Gunkko kind of feels like Uta from film Red in that her design feels too random. I think Uta is a very good comparison, actually. One of the things I said about her when the film Red trailer started coming out is that she's a character who's both over and under-engineered. There's a lot going on, a lot of clashing elements, but there's something about it that hits a lot of very generic anime notes and doesn't really fit into the Eiichiro Oda school of design. Which I guess makes sense because Oda did not create the character of Uta. However, he did design her. And there's actually some really early sketches where she feels infinitely more One Piece than I think Uta ended up being. To me, she has a lot more personality in these sketches, whereas Uta's final design ended up stripping a lot of that away from her and streamlining it into something that I'd expect to see in any other anime. Let's say My Hero Academia. I've been told that that's an anime. But like Gunkko, Uta's final design was also very top-heavy. Everything down to the waist was very meticulously detailed, and the other half is just bare legs, which I've gone on to discover has been quite a topic, at least in the vocal online community. This is probably going to sound beyond stupid, but I didn't even realize that Gunkko wasn't wearing pants at first. And I think that's because my head is still very much in egghead space, where no woman wore pants for 2 years. You got your Namis, your Robins, your Yorks, Bonnie, Stussy, etc. Not a pant to be seen among them, and hence why it's the only arc where Brook didn't even need to ask to see any panties, because this man was already living the dream. But also, if Frankie and Senor Pink have taught us nothing else, it's that a lack of pants is never the problem. I don't think anyone would be complaining if Gunkko was a bit less generic in everything else that she had to offer, and people are just jumping on the pants because they don't know how to express their thoughts in a way that doesn't involve making awful photoshops and claiming to have fixed the art. If that guy was Shanks, Loki would have reacted very differently to seeing him, considering that Shanks was the one who locked him up. So I thought that at first as well. But then I remember that Loki is blindfolded. At the moment, he's probably operating on some sort of Fujitora-style observation haki, where he can see and feel vague presences around him, cannot transform that information into a clear visual. Vigilant Frank does speak, though, with his voice. And I guess this confirms that at the very least, he doesn't sound the same as Shanks, which, was going to be very possible. And I was actually thinking the other day about whether or not Shanks' voice actor would play Vigilant Frank, because he definitely did in the anime episode where the man who we now believe is Frank went to speak with the Five Elders. But also, that's unfortunately probably not going to be an issue, because Shanks' voice actor, Shuichi Ikeda, has begun retiring from his iconic roles. The dude is 75 years old, and while Shanks hasn't been mentioned as of yet, this is the exact same path that Frankie's now retired voice actor went down. Kazuki Yao didn't immediately step back from everything. He started by retiring from his other characters before eventually announcing that he was going to leave Frankie as well. And as I mentioned before, this is just the reality of One Piece going forward. We've had voice actors on board with this show for more than 25 years now, so a huge amount of the cast are just aging, and we may very well get to the moment where the Holy Knights approach Loki in the anime and think, oh, no wonder Loki didn't recognize the voice, because that's not even the original Vigilant Frank. With all of that said, I do think this manga moment is pretty telling for anyone still holding out hope that this is Shanks. There are a few of you, I see you. But Loki seems to identify people based on their intangible, unique presence, and this guy just doesn't feel like Shanks. So can we assume that Loki is the a certain pirate that Frank wanted to discuss with the elders? Maybe. A lot of it is dependent on whether or not Loki was considered a pirate during his active days. He does have a, quote, special bounty, so the world government might classify Loki as something else, but then again, he was a rampaging madman sailing all over the New World just for the sake of being a bit of a dick, so he definitely fits into that pirate box. In which case, what happens then? Frank goes to the Five Elders because he wants to talk about Loki, a certain pirate, potentially to recruit him, to suggest recruiting him into the Holy Knights, which is a suggestion I imagine the other Five Elders would have ignored. They would have scoffed, as they didn't seem to show a great deal of care that Frank was there. In fact, they were acting like he was an inconvenience, which would make sense if he did not have world noble heritage, as these elderly gents sit there and wonder why this glorified insect is taking up our precious tea time. It's arrogance, classic world government arrogance. But this suggestion about Loki, if he is indeed the certain pirate, was probably taken a lot more seriously after the Five Elders were defeated. And if so, that would be a pretty awesome twist, because we've been speculating over who the certain pirate is since the moment that chapter dropped, and if the answer turns out that not only was the certain pirate a character we hadn't met yet, but even the person asking about said pirate wasn't even someone we'd properly met yet, then that would just be all sorts of mind screwy. One of the most iconic and dramatic moments of the Reverie arc, we didn't even know what the crap we were reading. And it's a good guess, but I still think there's a fairly high chance that the certain pirate was Shanks as well, although the more I think about it, the more Loki positive I'm becoming, especially if Frank was thinking of what they needed to eventually beat Shanks, and so he wanted to select someone who held a grudge against Shanks, which I think is a pretty good place to start. Probably goes without saying, but Blackbeard really embodies the whole thing about Nika as well. Not only is he a destroyer with his darkness and earthquake powers, but he liberated most of his crew from Impel Down and is one of the characters that laughs the most in the series. It's hard to find a time when he's on screen and not laughing, even when he's getting his ass kicked. I think there's definitely a good argument to be made for Blackbeard as well, although I would question the point about liberation, since Blackbeard does actively imprison people for the purpose of selling them into slavery to fund his wacky pirate pirate dreams. But he may also represent a counterforce to Nika, which has long since been speculated. The idea if there's a god of sun and light and general goodness, then there could also be a god of moon and darkness and general badness. Because at the very least, Luffy and Loki, they're all about freedom, but Blackbeard seems to want to take a more emo approach to things. He wants to rule the world. Blackbeard wants domain over everything. Jorel being stabbed in the head by a sword seems very similar to Shiki getting a steering wheel stuck in his head. It is a similar outcome, in that every time I see either Jorel or Shiki now, their bizarre misfortune does make me laugh. But I like the Jorel gag even better. I just love that he keeps saying, thankfully I was saved because I was wearing my helmet at the time, with the sword visibly going straight through his brain. And it's not just funny, but it's a very cool cultural aspect of Elbaf, or at least the old Elbaf, because I imagine that most people, they would get into some sort of panic about a blade being shoved in their heads, but not the warriors of Elbaf. They just get on with their lives unconcerned about the potential of death, and even inviting death to live with them, both metaphorically as a daily occurrence and very literally with a sword in the brain. This is how you portray the oldest living giant of Elbaf, because this dude would not have made it this far if something as simple as being impaled in the head would have killed him. Liam, I can't believe you talk about Loki resembling Usopp, but you don't talk about our lovable liar making up another tall tale to the giants by saying that he dealt the finishing blow to the legendary oars. So I can't believe I'm about to ask for this, but I really wish we got some reaction shots from the giants. I'm sure the anime will provide them plentifully, but one panel, just one panel of the giants staring up at Usopp in awe would have been fantastic. And look, what Usopp's doing here is quite dangerous, because the giants are in the presence of a legit Emperor of the Sea, and they might start to think of Usopp as someone who's in equivalency to Luffy. Because POV, you're a giant, right? For most of the existence of your species, there has been such a high focus in your society on behavior of honor and pride in combat, which means that you're not automatically gonna think or even suspect that someone's lying about their achievements in combat, because that's just not the honorable thing to do. And most of these giants haven't even left Elbaf. They don't know what other cultures are like. They might not even know of the existence of these lies of which I speak. So these giants now genuinely think that Usopp delivered the final blow to Oars, and this could backfire on him in a Tontata-esque situation, where Usopp made the Tontata tribe believe his lies about being a legendary heroic descendant of Noland. And once things get problematic, which it's going to be soon, once that happens, the giants are going to have pretty high expectations of Usopp. And I can only hope that he's able to deliver, that he can use being on the island of warriors and in the presence of warriors to summon the kind of courage and actions that he's been so rarely capable of in the past. Because right now he's on the island of his dreams, but he's still doing the same thing that he was doing right back at the dawn of One Piece, which is charming. As the commenter said, he's a lovable liar. But what I'm looking for is some evolution here, something to show us that Usopp has really grown since those days of Syrup Village. And while I wait for that, there was also a really funny moment of Jinbe, where one of the giants says, "Wow, your skin's like really blue." And then there's this beautiful shot of Jinbe with an expression like he's trying to calculate the probability of racism occurring. And also another fun moment was Sanji interacting with the giant women, which is showing that this boy has some skills that he rarely gets credit for, as these are not the first locals he's impressed with his shenaniganry. Sanji was also extremely popular with the mermaids of Fishman Island and the women of Wano, who were lining up all through the flower capital just to get a taste of his soba. So Sanji continues to live the dream. At this stage, he could comfortably retire in a heaven of his choosing. Loki showing the John Wick mentality. Gunkko gonna die hard. It is very John Wick, isn't it? What's that? You killed my dog, my big dog? Well, I guess I'm just gonna go ahead and destroy everything you know and love. Calling it now. Loki is going to be in the top 10 of the next character poll. I think top 10 is a big ask, but top 20, now that is well within the realm of possibility, because I'm liking Loki more and more with each passing chapter, and I think he has the potential to become a Katakuri-esque kind of character, one who fans can easily get on board with if he's a good guy at heart, but also someone who showcases some amazing action and really pushes Luffy, because that equation resulted in Katakuri being ranked in 14th place in the latest poll, which was the World Top 100, and took place years after Katakuri had faded from relevance. He has no right to be ranked that high. No right at all. Because the dude just sat in his safe space eating donuts for almost 900 chapters of One Piece, and in the space of half an arc, became one of the most beloved figures we never even knew we needed. And that's why I have pretty high hopes for Loki as well. Because I can feel that Katakuri or even higher potential, as did Luffy, which is why he went out of his way to take that trip to the underworld. What if the Tobi Roppo become Yamato's vassals? You see, that would be fun, because then Yamato would be properly going full Odin. Odin's journeys around Wano involved him collecting a series of misfits and outcasts, and even some characters like Ashura Doji, who would have been considered a villain by the rest of Wano at the time. So if Yamato could rehabilitate the Tobiropo and channel their power for the good of Wano, then that could be a very pleasant ending, perhaps with Yamato being made into a daimyo of a region just like Odin was, which would also track with the Odin story, because it's only after he became a daimyo that he set out to sea with Whitebeard. I loved this chapter. It made me laugh a lot of times, but my favorite part was seeing Colin. Okay, so I didn't even remember that Colin was in this chapter. I missed this, and quite frankly, shame on me for doing so. I have one job, it's to look at the drawings of the funny pirates and talk about them, and I didn't do it. But here is the drawing in question. It is Colin having a lovely time at this feast, striking the iconic sun god, joy boy, Luffy, all of the above pose. And I refuse to believe that this is an accident, because everything just matches so perfectly. Even the fact that Colin's face is obscured. Everything except the mouth, which is a massive joy boy Nika grin. Now, I don't think we should read too much into this necessarily. I'm definitely not suggesting that Colin is another potential Nika, but maybe more that he embodies the spirit of Nika in the same sort of way that Bartholomew Kuma did when he always performed the special dance. Although, then again, do not underestimate just how much potential Colin has to do things, because I do think there is a possible future where we look back at this panel and go, yep, it was all there. And maybe what's going to happen is that Colin will be the giant that one day inherits the sun god fruit, whether that be Loki's or even Luffy should bad death things occur to either one of them. And this could be foreshadowing Colin's worthiness to carry on the next generation. And I know I'm putting a lot into Colin stocks at the moment, my bank account is empty, but he's a child who's been directly inspired by both Luffy and Shanks, as well as the son of an allegedly great third pirate. So narrative nepotism favors Colin far, far more than most, if not all of the arc-specific children we've met so far. And if I've learned anything from this chapter, it's that I need to keep a closer eye on him, because Colin could end up becoming the future of this world.